it's like not the best time to ask.
Oh, I heard. power. We should have another strip. We should have another power strip.
I have a feeling people are going to get on a roll. Did they move it, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's... Oh, maybe it's this guy. I don't know.
I wonder if we could probably get it, don't you think? There's one space open.
The committee will come to order. Today's hearing will focus on the tragic Amtrak accident that occurred in Philadelphia on May 17th. We have all heard some of the preliminary information surrounding this terrible event. An Amtrak Northeast regional train en route from Washington to New York derailed at a curve in Philadelphia. The National Transportation Safety Board has reported that the train was traveling at 106 miles per hour despite a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit on that portion of the track. 8 passengers tragically lost their lives and approximately 200 were injured. We were not aware of any defects or issues identified to date with respect to the track, the locomotive, or other infrastructure. Today we will get an update from the NTSB on where their investigation stands and any additional information they can provide on the cause of this accident. Since the accident, the Federal Railroad Administration and Amtrak have taken several steps to improve safety along the Northeast Corridor. Amtrak is assessing all the curves along the NEC to determine if additional speed restrictions should be imposed. Amtrak has also announced it will be installing inward-facing cameras in its locomotives to help gain a better understanding of how incidents occur. And they've also committed to finish implementation of positive train control on the Northeast Corridor by December of this year. Today I want to review what actions Amtrak and the FRA took on passenger rail safety before this accident, particularly why FRA didn't mandate the review of severe curves sooner. Finally, this accident once again highlighted the central role the Northeast Corridor plays in moving people along the East Coast. The NEC represents 2% of the nation's landmass, but 18% of the population and 20% of our nation's GDP. Hundreds of thousands of people use the corridor daily to get to work, travel between some of our largest cities. When the corridor is out for just several days, there's a real and significant impact on people's lives and the economy. This committee is committed to focusing resources and improving the Northeast Corridor, including in our bipartisan Amtrak reform bill that passed the House just a few months ago. I look forward to working with my friends in the Senate to get that reform bill enacted into law. In closing, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses regarding these important issues. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member DeFazio from Oregon for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing today. I certainly agree with you about the extraordinary importance to the concentrated population on the East Coast of the United States on the use of this corridor on a daily basis in terms of the number of people that use it and the contribution to the economy and what happens when that corridor goes down. And I also agree that this committee does have a long-term commitment to Amtrak and other infrastructure needs in the United States. Unfortunately, that is not shared by your Republican colleagues on the Transportation, Housing, Urban Development Subcommittee. In fact, on the day of the accident, they cut a $251 million, or is it? $290 million from the capital budget of Amtrak. The capital budget goes to things like positive train control. It also goes to things like the 140-year-old tunnel. If that collapses or becomes unusable, the system will totally be out of use for an indefinite period of time, or many of the 100-year-old bridges that need repair or replacement along that line. Any cuts to the budget of Amtrak, which has a $21 billion backlog on critical infrastructure investments, maintenance investments, things that do include positive train control, do include bridges, bridge safety, do include signal systems and other things that are so outmoded. I don't think they're using even vacuum tubes. They're sort of before that era. This is, it's not okay. To further reduce that budget is going to jeopardize, minimally, the operation of this corridor, or even worse, cause an accident directly with a tunnel collapse or a bridge collapse or a failure of a signal system. We can't point to this accident and say that it was directly caused by a lack of investment. That's true. We still don't know what happened, and we're looking forward to the NTSB. But we do know that the NTSB, first in 1969, proposed that we should move forward with positive train control. They have something called the Most Wanted List. In 1990, the first edition of the Most Wanted List said we needed positive train control. And since that time, quite a number of people have died in preventable accidents around the country because of the lack of positive train control. Yes, human error. That's what positive train control is designed to prevent, human error. This was probably human error. We still don't know if there was a mechanical malfunction. It's a relatively new train set, but we don't know yet. The point is, PTC could prevent accidents like this. It could have prevented many other accidents over the last 2 decades since it was first recommended by NTSB, and we need to move forward with all due dispatch in installing that system on commuter railroads and other passenger railroads, and on the entire Amtrak system, and on those required critical freight lines, particularly those carrying hazardous materials, particularly through urban areas. So I'm pleased we're here today to try and understand better what caused this accident, what we might do to prevent them in the future. I don't think we're going to get to any definitive point, but for me, a bottom line is, we can no longer ignore a $21 billion backlog. We can't ignore we're running trains over 100-year-old bridges of dubious, stability. We can't ignore that we're running trains through 140-year-old tunnels that need total rehabilitation. We can't any longer ignore the fact that we have signalization systems that are, pre-vacuum tube era, that are trying to link into, more modern, sophisticated systems. So there is much to be done. And I wish that all our colleagues in Congress shared our commitment to infrastructure investment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and with the concurrence of the ranking member, will now recognize the subcommittee chairman on railroads, pipelines, and hazardous materials, Mr. Denham, for an opening statement.
Thank you and good morning. First, let me thank you for holding this hearing. Obviously, very important. I also want to thank the ranking member Capuano for quickly going up to Philadelphia and really surveying the situation with me. It was important to see firsthand and understand specifically some of the things that were happening. But let me talk a little bit about my frustration. We went up there to immediately assess the situation. NTSB was already making definitive statements, and now 3 weeks later, while we had a brand new locomotive, we still can't confirm whether or not there was a malfunction with that locomotive. And even though the NTSB made definitive statements, still cannot defend whether or not there was an operator error, cannot identify whether or not there was an engineer that bypassed the system. The engineer has been working with NTSB, but still cannot verify that the cell phone that was in use, whether it was texting or using cell phone service during that time. It's my understanding the engineer has given his password, and yet we can't still identify whether or not there's an issue. So my concern is that NTSB came out and made an immediate statement a couple of hours after the accident, but 3 weeks later is unable to identify any of these issues around it. I think this committee expects answers. I think the families are owed answers. I think the American public is looking to make sure that rail is safe across our entire nation. We're also looking for solutions. I'm looking forward to seeing PTC implemented in a very, very quick manner. But I would ask that you take a look at this emergency proclamation that was put out, emergency order that was put out by FRA. My concern is a year and a half ago, when we had Metro North, one of the worst accidents that this country has ever seen, almost the exact same emergency order was put out a year and a half ago. It's saying PTC was important. And yet we still don't have PTC on that area of track either. So now a new emergency order saying that we will have Amtrak on the Northeast Corridor by the end of the year, obviously we have concerns. We are looking for solutions. I think the families deserve to hear what those solutions are, but more importantly, that those solutions are actually put into place. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for having this hearing. I welcome the members of the board. I'm looking forward to your testimony. We all want answers. I know you want answers too, but I also want them to be right. More than anything else, they need to be right, not speculation. I also want to just comment that I know that many people along the Northeast Corridor, particularly those in Philadelphia, my friend Congressman Brady and my friend Congressman Fattar are watching this closely, and they want answers as well, and they'll be keeping a close eye on this. I guess, I'm looking forward to the specific lessons we learn, but I also think we need to look at the lessons that Congress should learn. What should our priorities be? We talk a good game, but we're the funders. Are we going to fund this, or are we not going to fund it? We talk a good game, but PTC is not new, and it's not limited just to Amtrak. Positive train control is an issue across the country on every rail line in this country. Are we going to require it, or are we not? Everybody here knows, we don't want to talk about it, that there are several proposals floating around Congress right now to delay it even further. And we all understand the realities and the costs involved, but those are questions we need to ask in a serious basis. How much responsibility will we as a member of Congress take on our shoulders the next time an accident happens and we look in the mirror? Have we done everything we can reasonably do to prevent it? And I think that I'm not looking for scapegoats. I am looking for answers, as we all are. And I have full faith that the NTSB, along with the FRA and Amtrak, will find those answers. And I want them quickly, but more importantly, I want them right. And again, I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate the chairman's calling this hearing very much. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to welcome our panel of witnesses. Thank you for being here today. First, the Honorable Christopher Hart, who's the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. Next, the Honorable Joseph Boardman, the president and chief executive officer of Amtrak. Next, Ms. Sarah Feinberg, the acting administrator for Federal Railroad Administration, and just been nominated, so congratulations as you go through that process. Good luck. And Dennis Pierce, the national president of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. Again, thank you all for being here. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony, complete written testimony is going to be in the record, we'd ask you to keep it to about 5 minutes, your statement. And with that, we'll start with Mr. Hart. Please proceed.
Thank you and good morning. Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting the NTSB to appear before you today. Earlier this morning, we released a preliminary report on this investigation. It's a summation of facts that were released up to this point, and I would like to review these facts briefly with you this morning. At approximately 9:21 p.m. on Tuesday, May 12th, Amtrak Regional Train 188 derailed at Frankfort Junction, north of Philadelphia's 30th Street Station.
Can you pull your mic closer?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. As the chairman mentioned, the NTSB has determined that seconds before the derailment, the train was traveling at 106 miles an hour, heading into a 50-mile-per-hour curve. Emergency braking was applied, but the train slowed to only 102 miles an hour before the data recording ended. Sadly, 8 people were killed and more than 200 people were injured as a result of this accident. On behalf of the NTSB, I would like to offer my sincerest condolences to those who lost loved ones, and our thoughts remain with those who are still recovering from their injuries. Briefly, areas we will explore in this investigation include track, recorder, mechanical, signals, operations, human performance, survival factors, and medical. Much work remains, but there are a few facts that I can report to you today. We know that a properly installed and functional positive train control, or PTC, would have prevented this accident. PTC is technology that is designed to prevent overspeed derailments, as well as train-to-train collisions, incursions into roadway work protection zones, and proceeding through misaligned switches. The accident we have investigated have shown us that we need technology that can step in when humans fail due to distraction, medical conditions, or other factors. As a result, the NTSB has called for train control technology for decades, as was mentioned, since 1969. Present law requires implementation of PTC by the end of this year, fully 7 years after the mandate was signed by Congress into law. We know that most railroads will not comply with this law. Those railroads that have made the difficult decisions and invested in this proven safety enhancement should be commended for their leadership. Any extension of this deadline must have a transparent accounting of the steps that will be taken to meet a new deadline. Regulators and policymakers need that information to make important policy decisions, and the traveling public deserves that accountability. Rail car crashworthiness is another area that we will investigate. As you can see from the pictures, the survivable space in the first passenger car was severely compromised. We will fully document and analyze the damage to this car and other cars and make recommendations that the NTSB determines are necessary to improve crashworthiness and build on existing recommendations in this area. We have received full cooperation from the crew in their interviews and follow-up conversations. As you know, we are evaluating the engineer's cell phone records to correlate the timing of the data and voice activity on May 12th with the accident timeline. This process involves reviewing the timestamps from the phone records, which are from different time zones, with data from other recorded information, such as the locomotive event recorder, the outward-facing video camera, radio communications, and surveillance video. When we have clarity on this timeline, we will release this information to you and to the public. Additionally, the NTSB has called for inward and outward-facing video and audio recorders on trains since 2007. While Amtrak uses outward-facing cameras, they were not using inward-facing cameras at the time of this accident. These cameras can provide critical information to the NTSB as we work to determine ways to prevent future accidents. In this case, the engineer states that he has no memory of the events leading up to the derailment. Video could fill in those gaps. I'm encouraged by Amtrak's announcement that they intend to install inward-facing cameras, but we also recommended installing locomotive cab audio recorders as well. We look forward to learning more about Amtrak's initiative, and I hope the FRA will proceed with requiring the installation of both inward-facing video cameras and locomotive cab audio recorders throughout the U.S. rail fleet. As I stated, we have much work ahead of us, and I will keep you informed as this investigation proceeds. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm available to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. And with that, Mr. Boardman, please proceed.
Thank you. I must start this morning by offering my heartfelt regret for the recent derailment at Frankfort Junction. It was Amtrak's train on our railroad, and we're responsible for the incident and its consequences. I regret it deeply, and based on the conversations I've had over the last 3 weeks, that sentiment is shared by everyone in our company. Everything we've done since the accident has been driven by a sincere hope that we could do something, however small, to mitigate the suffering and loss that everyone endured as a result of this terrible accident. We've been greatly helped in that effort by the people of Philadelphia, and I would like to thank all of them, but particularly Mayor Nutter, the police, the fire and EMS services, and the staff of the hospitals who received and treated the injured. Thank you for everything you did on behalf of our passengers and our employees. I should also take this opportunity to note that we want to do everything we can to support the NTSB's investigation. I'll refrain from addressing matters that are still under investigation. We'll be working closely with both the NTSB and our regulators, the FRA, to ensure that we address the root causes of this accident. And to you, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, and to our passengers and employees, we run a safe railroad, and safety will continue to be our top priority. The Northeast Corridor in particular has an excellent safety record, and this accident is so shocking because it's so unexpected. In no other place in the country is a comparable volume of traffic moved with such a solid record. The last previous derailment fatal accident on the Northeast Corridor occurred 28 years ago. The Northeast Corridor safety systems are the best in the country. We operate a layered signal system that provides trains with multiple levels of protection. There's a trackside signal system. There's an alerter to ensure that engineers are awake. There's a cab signal system. There's an automatic train control system, ATC, to prevent train collisions and stop the train if the crews fail to acknowledge or comply with signals. And finally, in places, there's the Advanced Civil Speed Enforcement System, ACCESS. That's Amtrak's positive train control system, to stop trains if engineers fail to comply with authorized speed limits. ACCESS is in service from New Haven to Boston and at points between Washington and New York where trains exceed 125 miles an hour. It's installed in the rest of the Amtrak owned and operate Northeast Corridor and should be operational in time to comply with the federal statutory mandate of December 31st, 2015. These systems backstop the people who are responsible for safe movement of our trains. We operate a thorough training, oversight, and coaching system for our crews. Our engineers and conductors are required to pass an extensive FRA-approved training program and to develop a very high level of familiarity with the route. Probably millions of train movements negotiated the curve at Frankfurt Junction safely since Amtrak took over the Northeast Corridor in 1976. The system works because, generally speaking, we've put together a series of layered nets, each guarding the previous layer. We rely on these systems, but we have never been able to completely eliminate the risk of human error. There's always a risk of a gap in even the most tightly woven net. The train 188 derailment revealed one such hole in our safety net. And in the weeks since the derailment, many people have raised a seemingly simple question. Why didn't the tracks where the accident occurred have some kind of safety feature installed to trip the signals and force the engineer to slow the train? This is the right question to ask, and I'm going to address it directly while providing you the necessary background information to understand the answer. In 1990, an Amtrak train derailed on a sharp curve in Back Bay Station in Boston and collided with an oncoming MBTA train. That derailment was caused by an engineer failing to slow before a curve. Shortly thereafter, industry regulators and operators reviewed the NEC and looked for other places where the approach speed of a train was greater than the speed at which the train might derail in the curve if an engineer failed to slow down. At those points, we modified the ATC system by installing a code if an engineer failed to, a code change point, to force engineers to slow down. The southbound tracks at Frankfurt Junction were one such place. The derailment speed at Frankfurt Junction is 98 miles an hour. Northbound trains approach that curve at 80 miles an hour, while the southbound train approaches at 110 miles an hour. So in short, when a train approaches from one direction but doesn't slow down, there's no risk of derailment. But if a train comes from the other direction and doesn't slow down for whatever reason, there is a risk of derailment. We therefore applied the modification to the southbound tracks so that trains approaching from the north at speeds of 110 would receive a signal indication in the cab just before the curve, forcing them to slow to 45 miles an hour so that they could pass through the curve safely at 50 miles an hour. The northbound track did not have the same protection installed because the approach speed was 80 miles an hour, which was slow enough that a train could round the curve at that speed without derailing if the engineer failed to slow down. At that time, the notion that an engineer might actually accelerate into the northbound curve was not a circumstance we anticipated, and thus we didn't mitigate for it. It was a reasonable decision reached by reasonable experts under reasonable circumstances. And since this and similar change points were installed in 1991, the application of this policy successfully prevented overspeed derailments throughout the Northeast Corridor for about 25 years. That clearly changed on May 12th. The proper response now is for us to figure out what happened and to narrow or eliminate the gap so that this accident cannot happen again. The full implementation of PTC later this year will be a major step forward in this regard. Until it is fully in service, we are working now with the FRA to implement the measures called for in the emergency order to ensure that the safety of our trains and passengers. The most important thing we can do, however, is to implement PTC. Amtrak is the nation's leader in PTC. We were the first railroad to secure regulatory approval for our PT system in the 1990s, the first to put it into operation, and the only company to have a system approved for use for speeds up to 150 miles an hour. No other Class I railroad in the United States, not one, is as far along in installing PTC as Amtrak is. My belief in the importance of PTC predates my arrival at Amtrak. As the Federal Railroad Administrator, I worked hard to secure the passage of the law requiring PTC installation on the railroads. I still believe that the single greatest contribution that my generation of railroaders can make to this industry is to implement PTC as rapidly as possible. And I promise you that by the end of this year, this system, which will dramatically enhance safety, will be complete and operational on the NEC. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. With that, Ms. Feinberg, you may proceed.
Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss issues related to the May 12th Amtrak accident in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the safety of passenger rail. We extend our deepest sympathies to the victims of this accident and to their loved ones. And I can assure them that we will take every step we can to ensure an accident like this cannot happen again. I also want to thank the City of Philadelphia, its mayor, and its first responders for their heroic and incredible response to this accident. Their leadership was truly remarkable. Let me say at the outset, all of us at the FRA are heartbroken about this tragic accident. The driving mission of our organization is to keep the public safe. And so while every accident matters to us, this accident in particular, which appears to have been preventable, and which took so many lives and left so many injured, is truly painful for our FRA family. We continue to investigate the circumstances surrounding the accident. While it will take time to complete the investigation, we have not and will not wait to take actions that will improve the safety of Amtrak as well as other passenger rail operations. On May 16th, 4 days after the accident, I directed Amtrak to take several actions before allowing its operations to resume north of Philadelphia. I followed those directives with an emergency order on May 21st. Amtrak has complied with those directives thus far, and the FRA will ensure that Amtrak follows through to fully implement them. When we released the May 21st emergency order, we also stated that we were considering taking additional steps to direct similar orders at other passenger railroads that may have similar curve and speed issues. We continue our work on those directives, and we plan to release additional information about that work in the coming days. And while the cause of this accident has not been officially determined, we do know that speed was a significant factor. And speed, simply put, is what we refer to as a human factor, a factor based on human behavior. Human factors remain the leading cause of all rail accidents. They are also the most difficult to address. But today, I want to announce that FRA is preparing a package of actions that we will finalize in the coming weeks and months, aimed at addressing just these kinds of factors, human factors, factors such as speed, distraction, and training. These actions may include additional emergency orders, safety advisories, rulemakings, agreements, or other initiatives. And again, beyond just those next steps, I want to assure you that the FRA is firmly committed to continue taking additional actions, as many as it takes, that will mitigate the risks and hazards identified in the ongoing investigation. Now, there has been significant amount of public discussion about what specifically would have prevented this accident, which specific technology and which new regulation. But the reality is if we believe that the cause of this accident was speed, it would have been prevented by positive train control. As this committee is well aware, positive train control is the single most important railroad safety technological development in more than a century. And it is absolutely necessary to ensuring the kind of safety that we expect on our rail system. Per the Congress's mandate, railroads are required to install PTC on all passenger routes and certain freight routes by December 31st, 2015, 7 months from now. FRA has been actively pushing the railroads to have PTC fully implemented by the deadline. We have met with the railroads for years on this issue. We have hired staff to assist and oversee the implementation of this technology. We have urged the submission of PTC safety and implementation plans. We have inquired with individual railroads and with the AAR about their progress. We have worked with the FCC to resolve issues related to spectrum. We have also urged, year after year, for more funding to be directed at commuter railroads and at Amtrak to implement positive train control. For the past 2 years, as part of the Grow America Act, FRA has requested $825 million to assist commuter railroads with the implementation of PTC, as well as additional funding to aid with Amtrak's implementation of PTC. Grow America has also proposed that FRA be granted authority to review, approve, and certify PTC safety plans on a railroad-by-railroad basis. FRA asked for this authority in order to ensure that railroads would be forced to work with safety regulators to take other or equivalent actions to raise the bar on safety even prior to full PTC implementation. We believe it is important that even those railroads that fail to meet the congressionally mandated deadline be required to improve safety in the interim. Despite the many challenges facing full implementation of PTC, the FRA's role is to carry out the enforcement of the deadline that is mandated by the Congress and to ensure that railroads implement PTC as quickly, safely, and efficiently as possible. And so on January 1, 2016, the FRA will be prepared to take necessary enforcement actions against railroads that have failed to meet the deadline. Safety will always be the FRA's first priority. We appreciate this committee's attention and focus to issues related to the tragic Amtrak passenger train accident in Philadelphia. Again, I want to express our deepest sorrow for the victims and their families. We look forward to working with this committee to improve our programs and make the American rail network as safe, reliable, and efficient as possible. And I'm happy to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Feinberg. And now, Mr. Pierce, you may proceed.
Good morning, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, and committee members. The membership of the BLET and the Teamsters Rail Conference that I represent, thank you for the
Can you
invitation.
pull that microphone closer?
Okay.
It's easier.
Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I first want to express our sincerest condolences to the victims of Amtrak 188 and to their family. This is sadly familiar territory for me because I've had to convey BLET's sorrow to the families of 11 members killed in the line of duty since I became national president 5 years ago. And I fear that this will happen many more times. It's even more tragic when technology could have prevented a death and positive train control could have saved 5 of those lives. The NTSB has confirmed that excess speed contributed to the derailment of Amtrak 188 and also that this accident was PTC preventable. These facts implicate several core elements of federal oversight of the railroad industry: the PTC mandate, crew size, fatigue, inward-facing cameras, and our expectations for Amtrak. The small percentage of Americans who are working locomotive engineers and all railroad operating employees are among the most highly skilled, highly trained, and highly regulated professionals in the nation. But today's workforce or workplace often creates task overload for engineers, and when too much is expected of any system, man or machine, a breakdown is inevitable. One of the questions before us now is what level of risk we're willing to accept knowing all of that. Most of the industry, but not Amtrak or BNSF, seeks a blanket 5 to 7 year extension of the December 31st PTC deadline. Although not on the NEC, there have been peripheral problems with radio spectrum and FCC radio tower approvals, and those must be addressed. But they do not justify a blanket delay, and I urge you to not be stampeded into granting one. That would dishonor the memory of those that perished on May 12th. And we must remember that PTC is no silver bullet. It's not designed to prevent every accident, and any claim that PTC renders a second crew member unnecessary is just plainly put not true. PTC cannot replace the second crew member because it doesn't do the work of a second crew member. It isn't the second set of eyes and ears trained on the road ahead to monitor the left side of the train for defects, stuck brakes, or observe the left side of the highway rail crossings for highway rail grade incidents, or to separate the trains when we have first responders that need to get access. We urge you to take up Congressman Young's Safe Freight Act, H.R. 1763, addressing those concerns, and we also think the time may have come to reconsider the 1981 NERSA language that eliminated the second crew member on Northeast Corridor locomotives. While we do not know whether fatigue played a part on Amtrak 188, fatigue should be a major concern to all of us. To be frank, the 2008 overhaul of the rail hours of service has produced very little progress towards mitigating fatigue. Work schedules are still far too variable and unpredictable, especially on freight railroads. And instead of dealing with all issues contributing to fatigue, some have settled on single issues like sleep apnea. I'm here to tell you that CPAP machines won't address fatigue caused by variable and unpredictable work schedules because you have to know when to sleep in order to get the benefit. We must redouble our efforts to eliminate the systemic fatigue in the railroad industry. I'd also like to address the call for inward-facing cameras because it gets louder by the day. And we have said this for over 2 years. Cameras can be an accident investigation tool, but they create a false sense of security if more than that is expected. Cameras don't slow or stop trains, positive train control does, and that's really the plainest way to put it. Our privacy concerns with cameras are what I would call America's privacy concerns. Many railroads insist on leaving cameras on continuously, even when trains are stopped on a siding for hours at a time, with crews captive on a locomotive that comprises about 65 square feet of space. Constant surveillance like this we view as un-American, and it really does nothing to improve railroad safety. The truth is that some railroads have shown more interest in using the camera data to punitively attack certain employees than for post-accident investigations, and that is just unacceptable to us. Finally, some things do come down to dollars and cents, at least for Amtrak, which cannot continue to survive on the funding that it receives. What we spend on passenger rail is embarrassing when compared to China, the UK, France, Austria, and even India, Russia, and Turkey. We cannot expect Amtrak to run a first-class railroad if it's funded at third-world levels. We cannot expect reliable performance from infrastructure that is 75 or 100 or even 125 years old. Our transportation infrastructure is crumbling around our feet, including Amtrak, yet Amtrak is a good investment, a necessary resource, and shortchanging Amtrak creates other costs elsewhere. I strongly urge you to provide the resources necessary for Amtrak to thrive and grow and not to just limp along. I appreciate the opportunity to address you today. We have worked with this committee to accomplish much to enhance rail safety, and I look forward to working with you to implement the lessons learned from Amtrak 188. Thank you again for the invitation, and I'll answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pierce. We'll start with a round of questions, and I would encourage all members to, there's a lot of interest. This is an important topic, so I'd encourage you to keep to 5 minutes. If the interest remains high, we'll consider doing a second round of questions. So again, please respect the 5 minutes. There's a lot of folks here that I think are going to ask questions, and I will be quick with the gavel, so watch the clock. I'll start out. Ms. Feinberg, in December of 2013, with the Metro North commuter train derailment, it was a very similar circumstance. Train was going too fast, and the accident required the FRA required Metro North to put the codes into the ATC system to automatically slow the trains going at those speeds. And now you've just issued an emergency order that literally cuts and pastes that order from 2 years ago to be put on Amtrak. It seems that the next logical step, and I think you said this, is right now you're going to look at all the curves, but don't you think they should have done that after the Metro North derailment? Should have put out an order, FRA, to say, and I know you weren't there at the time, but wouldn't that have been the logical step at that time to say, let's look at the Northeast Corridor, let's look at the curves?
Well, what we actually did at that time was we put out a safety advisory urging commuter railroads to take a look at their curves and to see if there were additional steps that they should take. The emergency order that went out at that time was aimed at Metro North. And I know, as you know, emergency orders are very narrow. They cannot be particularly broad. They have to be legally sustainable and enforceable. And at the time, the FRA looked at expanding that emergency order to many other railroads, to all commuter railroads, and deemed that it would not be legally enforceable and that we did not have evidence to show that we had this problem elsewhere. As you may remember, Metro North had a series of fatal and non-fatal accidents. They seem to have a systemic safety culture problem. And when we looked beyond Metro North, we did not feel that this was a systemic problem at other railroads. We were not seeing derailments at other railroads. We were not seeing engineers at high speeds. And so we believed the emergency order aimed at Metro North would only be enforceable for Metro North. We did a safety advisory aimed at others.
Legally, you thought you didn't have the ability to do the Northeast Corridor?
That's correct.
What does the EO today, are you able to enforce it throughout the Northeast Corridor, have them look at it? Or do you have legal problems there?
The EO that went out last week was, 10 days ago, was aimed specifically at Amtrak. We're now looking beyond Amtrak to see if we want to take similar or other steps aimed at other commuter railroads. But we wanted to act quickly, aimed at Amtrak, and now we're looking at what else should be done beyond that.
So only Amtrak?
For the emergency order, correct.
Does that mean that you have the authority to tell Connecticut and Massachusetts, which have state-owned lines, are they able to be included in that, or is that legally, you have legal problems with that?
That would not work for the emergency order that's currently out, but that's what we're looking at right now for next steps.
See if you can include them. Okay. Mr. Boardman, positive train control. You said in your statement you're committed to getting it by the end of the year. Can you talk a little bit about the process you've been going through the last couple of months? I know we had this conversation about spectrum. That's really was the last step of the equation. And can you talk a little bit about the cost and the money? You have the money. And can you talk a little bit about the spectrum?
We, at this point in time, do have the positive train control installed on the Northeast Corridor, all sections that we own on the Northeast Corridor spine. What we had learned, along with the freight railroads, that the 900 megahertz system that exists right now really wasn't providing the kind of reliability and was having even more difficulty in high-density areas. So the decision was by all railroads that we needed to go to a 220 megahertz kind of radio system. That really provides a much better propagation of the signal and a much more reliable service. So what we've been doing is making sure that we finally received approval for the 220 megahertz system within the last couple of months, and we have to test it. We have to get the data radios ready, and that's what we're doing now. So that's where we are.
And you learned that because you had PTC operational from Boston, New Haven to Boston, is that correct?
That's correct, along with the PTC we had in Michigan.
That's where you learned the lessons for that. And then the entire stretch from Washington, D.C. to Boston will be under that new increased megahertz.
For everything that we own or control.
Right, correct. What would Massachusetts and Connecticut with state-owned?
There's a section between New York and New Haven that's owned from New Rochelle actually to New Haven that we don't own or control. That's owned by New York State and by Connecticut under control of Metro North.
Thank you very much. Seeing my time has expired in the 5-minute rule, I turn to Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hart, you implied, and you didn't expand upon it, that you're going to look at the cars themselves, whether or not more resilient cars could better protect passengers in crashes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Have you looked at that previously?
Yes, we've been looking at passenger car crashworthiness for quite a few years.
And what can we design? What, Mr. Boardman, I believe these cars are what era, 70s?
They started being delivered in about 1975.
And have you asked to replace them?
We have a plan to rebuild these cars, and we are replacing some cars at this point in time, the ones that were built in the 40s.
And in the 40s?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And are you going to somehow improve their resilience in the case of crash?
Our expectation is to be able to use crash energy management, which is something that the entire passenger industry is beginning to do.
But these current cars don't meet whatever.
They do not.
They do not. And what would that take?
In terms of dollars or time?
Yeah. I mean, have you asked for this money?
If we asked for replacement of all the equipment we have, we're probably talking $3.5 to $4 billion.
Have you made a request?
We have made requests for rebuilding. We haven't, and we've made some requests for replacing.
Okay. And what happened to those requests?
The request for replacing was a complex request because if they were long-distance trains or they weren't receiving enough revenue for us to be able to pay back.
But the bottom line is, were you allocated the money or not?
No, sir.
Okay. So Congress denied you the money?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Again, back to Mr. Hart. Do you believe that we could either rehab these cars he's talking about in a way that would increase resilience and survivability, or do you think they need to be totally replaced?
Well, thank you for the question. That's one of the things we'll be looking into, and we'll look into it here just as we are currently with the WMATA accident in terms of the crashworthiness of their cars. We're looking into what it will take to improve.
Pull your microphone closer, please.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. We're looking into that, yes, both for this accident as we are with the WMATA accident in terms of the crashworthiness of the cars. We don't know yet whether it would be new cars or whether these can be fixed.
Okay. When I look at photos, I mean, the locomotive looks pretty intact, and of course that's new construction, and the engineer obviously survived. Yet that first car I've never seen, and I heard some first responders say they'd never ever dealt with anything like that before. So, I mean, that implies, are there in other nations or elsewhere around the world where they have modern railroads, do they have more crashworthiness in their passenger cars?
That will be part of our investigation, is what other countries are doing in this respect, because we are very concerned about making sure that we are the leading edge of crashworthiness for our passenger cars.
Okay. Ms. Feinberg, on the positive train control, I appreciate what you said about you're going to push really hard. You know, commuter railroads are one of the greatest laggards here, and they have asked for help from Congress. Congress has not been forthcoming. How are we going to deal with the commuter railroads? And many of those operate on a margin or at a loss now to get this technology installed.
That's right. We've asked for $875 million to assist commuter railroads in implementing PTC. We've also opened up the RIF program for railroads who are looking for loans that will assist with PTC implementation. So we just completed work on I believe, $967 million loan to MTA that will assist with PTC implementation. And then as we approach the deadline, one of the things we have asked the Congress for authority for previously is to work with railroads who absolutely won't miss the deadline, or who absolutely will miss the deadline, to work with them to raise the safety bar in the interim while they are still working to implement.
So they would adopt some sort of interim operating changes to compensate for the lack of positive train control?
Exactly, and they would have to go through an approval process and work with us. We would continue to hold their feet to the fire to make sure we were working towards PTC implementation.
And would you look at a stepped process, those who are really trying and have been delayed by the FCC or otherwise, versus those who just haven't tried at all?
I would expect it would be merit-based, correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll go Subcommittee Chairman Denham for the next round of questionings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boardman, what operational changes has Amtrak made since the accident?
Could you ask that question?
In the last 3 weeks, what operational changes has Amtrak made, and will Amtrak be instituting more training and other efforts to ensure engineers are following all speed limits?
We did the code change on the northbound section of the Frankfurt curve as requested by the FRA. We've been evaluating the rest of the curves as required by the FRA, and also checking our entire northeast corridor to ensure that we had speed limit signs along the way, which all met the requirements of the emergency order. So we've done that. In terms of how we check on our engineers, we have a very robust and regular method that we check engineers. For example, just since January 1st of 14 till now, we've had over 16,000 speed checks of engineers along the northeast corridor. So that's like 35 times a day do we check somebody along the northeast corridor to make sure that they're operating at the right speed. We have a recurrent training program, a block training program that lasts for a week every year for each engineer, and they have to be certified on a biennial basis. So we continue to do that. We continue any kinds of changes that occur. We continue to provide additional training for engineers.
Thank you. And how many curves does Amtrak now have after doing this audit that have ATC? How many do you still have that don't have it that you want to implement the ATC on?
And after the Back Bay accident and the consensus for what we needed to accomplish, they identified 6 curves. One of those was the northbound section of the Frankfurt curve. Since FRA requested us to look at it under the new circumstances, we've identified at least 4 more at this point in time. We have 300 curves on the northeast corridor that could meet the newer conditions, and we're moving forward with those.
One of the questions that has continued to come up, we've done the passenger rail reauthorization bill, we've funded it fully out of this committee. What guarantees do we have that the Northeast Corridor profits will actually be used to implement new safety and PTC regulations?
The way that we have worked with the committee on how we're developing a program is to make safety decisions on safety issues. And funding decisions are really about the larger scale of infrastructure, not only for the railroad, but for highways and for aviation, which I've been talking about for several years at this point in time, and the necessity for increases in that way. Safety decisions, we're making those decisions and making sure that we provide safety decisions.
I guess the fundamental question is, when we pass a broad bill like that, what types of guarantees would there be on the priorities of those spending patterns? Last year, Amtrak spent $350 million on new cars. That may be an important issue, but the question would be, is it a priority of Congress, and is it a priority of Amtrak, and do those priorities align?
We think they do, Congressman. We work regularly with the staff of the committee. We work with the FRA. We work with all of those who are interested both in safety and the improvements along the Northeast Corridor. The sufficiency of funding to do all the things that we want to do, there's always scarce resources. So we have to make those decisions based on those scarce resources, but we don't reduce the idea that we need to have a safe railroad. We make safe decisions along the way.
Thank you. And my time's nearly expired, but before I yield back, let me just thank you for your efforts. Ms. Feinberg, FRA, NTSB, as well as the Mayor of Philadelphia, all coming together for a very, very rapid response. I appreciate not only the collaboration, but certainly the timeliness. And I know, speaking on behalf of Mr. Capuano and I, being able to tour that with you and help to understand how we can resolve these problems in the future. Thank you.
Thank
I
you,
yield
gentlemen.
back.
Mr. Capuano is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the board for the panel from the testimony you've had. It's very thoughtful, a very difficult decision to make on how to make prioritization. Mr. Hart, I'd like to ask you, has the NTSB taken a look, and I'm not so sure you have, and I'm not even sure you should, but I'm just kind of, have you taken a look at the decisions on prioritization of the PTC, or is that beyond the scope of your normal activities?
We would look at the specific event that we're investigating and determine what needs to be done to prevent that event from happening again.
All right, but you wouldn't be in the business of determining whether the prioritization made by Amtrak or others, if PTC, let's assume everybody did PTC tomorrow. It can't be implemented tomorrow. Every single rail company in the country would have to make a determination, what do we do first, second, third, fourth, fifth? That would not be in the normal purview of the NTSB?
That's correct. We would look at what needs to be done, i.e. PTC implementation, exactly how we would leave that to the implementers.
That's fair enough. That's what I expected. Ms. Feinberg, I'm just curious. Do you agree with Mr. Boardman's comments that the Amtrak will reach the December 2015 deadline to get PTC on the entire Northeast Corridor?
We see no reason why they will not meet that deadline. We believe they will.
And do you have any estimate of time frame for the rest of the Amtrak system beyond the Northeast Corridor?
Well, beyond the Northeast Corridor, other than in Michigan, that the Amtrak service will be dependent on freights implementing PTC, and so that could take some time.
Do you have any estimates of the cost of that?
The cost is well into the billions. Billions have been spent, and they've got billions. They've got billions further to go.
Multiple billions of dollars to the rest of the Amtrak system.
Yes.
And what about the rest of the Class 1 freight railroads? How much would that cost to get from where we are to full implementation? Do you have any estimate on that?
I actually thought that was the question you were just asking. So again, billions.
So that'd be all the Class 1, including Amtrak. What about the short lines? Are they going to be implementing positive train control, or is it just for the Class 1s and Amtrak?
It's for Class 1s and for passenger railroads.
So that the short freights will not be doing it?
We are working with the short lines a bit separately.
What about commuter rail?
Yes.
Will they be doing it?
Yes.
What about subway systems? I know that's not necessarily in your purview, but I know that'd be the FTA, but I would hope that the FTA would be working with you on that.
We work closely with the FTA, and they work closely with their organizations.
So in the final analysis, I mean, even if, under the best-case scenario, that the government was flush with money and every private rail company were flush with money, it would take multiple billions of dollars in many years to get from where we are to where we want to be on positive trade control across the nation on every line. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I would certainly agree with you on multiple billions with a B, but in terms of multiple years, I mean, I worry that we are approaching that position, but we believe that there is a congressionally mandated deadline for December 31st, 2015. We intend to enforce against it. This is not a new requirement for railroads.
Yeah. Mr. Hart, have you taken a look on this accident whether seatbelts would have helped or not?
That is part of our passenger survivability investigation. Yes, we are looking
Okay,
at that.
so that will be part of your final report when you have one?
Yes.
Because I just rode the train up to Philadelphia with Mr. Denham. There are no seatbelts on the train. Yet I flew down here today from Boston. I had a seatbelt. I had a seatbelt on the entire time. And it would strike me that, I don't know, have no idea, and I'm looking forward to your report, that seatbelts would be something that should be considered both to prevent death and injury.
We will be looking at that as part of the survivability aspect.
Ms. Feinberg, if the NTSB were to recommend seatbelts in passenger trains, would that be something you would pursue?
It would certainly be something that we would look at. There are different opinions about the requirement of seatbelts on trains.
Different opinions?
Yeah, while I recognize that seatbelts might seem like a good solution in the event of an accident, there are also people who tend to be up and walking around between cars during an accident, and the fact that you would have to harden the seats in order to put seatbelts into the seats.
Well, I understand the
might
concern
actually-
about whether they should be put into current configurations, but I would suggest that people who have concerns about seatbelts talk to the people at the NTSB about automobiles, about planes. I understand that, again, maybe the current configuration might need to be addressed over time, but the concept of seatbelts, again, I was under the impression that it was no longer debatable that seatbelts in an accident at high speeds on any mode of transportation, preferable to no seatbelts. If that's the case, maybe I'll take mine out in the car, too.
We would certainly work closely with the NTSB, just as we do on every recommendation, but there is a belief that the hardening of the seats that would be required in order to put seatbelts onto trains would actually cause more injuries in an accident.
So we're back at it again. It's a cost-benefit analysis. How many people will have to die or get injured before we take the next step? The same question
No.
we had in automobiles 100 years ago, the same questions we've had with planes, and now we'll go through trains.
No,
Thank you, Mr.
sir,
Chairman.
not a cost-benefit issue. It's simply how do you keep the most people inside the car safe?
Thank you. With that, Mr. Duncan is recognized 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Ms. Feinberg, last week Secretary Fox appeared to agree that this accident was not necessarily caused by a lack of funding. In fact, his exact quote was, "I don't think you can categorically say that more funding would have changed things." Do you agree with that statement?
I think he was referring to the actual behavior of the engineer. I do think there are consequences to funding issues, yes.
All right. Mr. Boardman, I noticed that total operating revenues of Amtrak have gone up from 2.4 billion to 3.1 billion over the last 5 years, about a 700 million or roughly 20% increase in funding. And that, on top of that, the federal government has given you 1.4 billion in additional funds each year. And I'm wondering, I'm assuming that you felt that Amtrak was moving fast enough in installing positive train control, because you said in your testimony that you were ahead of every other railroad. Is that correct?
We are ahead of every other railroad.
And I'm also assuming that you were shocked by this accident, because you testified that it's been 28 years since you had a derailment caused a fatality, or a fatality caused by a derailment. So railroad passenger travel is still about the safest method of transportation. Is that correct?
We believe that, yes.
And did you ever tell this committee or the Congress that you weren't, that you didn't have the funds to move fast enough on installation of positive train control?
We did not.
All right. Ms. Feinberg, and how do you intend to, what enforcement actions would you take against railroads that aren't moving fast enough? And would a railroad be given credit? For instance, if one railroad is a little bit behind another railroad in installation, but they have a better safety record, or maybe they have the best safety record of any railroad, would they be given credit for that good safety record?
We are having an internal conversation at FRA now about how exactly we will plan to enforce against the deadline. Just as we discussed previously, there are some railroads have behaved here better than others, certainly, and we don't want to punish railroads that are farther ahead for the behavior of railroads who have not done any work on implementation at all. So we're having an internal conversation. We've got discretion within the statute on how we enforce against the deadline. Can include anything from very little enforcement to daily civil penalties.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. And with that, Mr. Ciros is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I ride the Amtrak just about every week. And this accident really hit home. Ms. Feinberg and Mr. Boardman, can you speak to the future of Amtrak and passenger rail if Congress continues to use patchwork approach to funding improvements?
Well, I'd like to, Mr. Saras, say, and I've said many times, and especially the chairman, I think, that my concern has been the reliability of the railroad, the reliability of what we do for our hardware on our catenary system, the reliability of our use of tunnels, whether it is into New York or whether it's through the Baltimore tunnels, that our reliability on the Portal Bridge that's ready to be rebuilt that doesn't always shut properly. So the funding for infrastructure on the Northeast Corridor is absolutely behind the curve. In the last reauthorization of our funding in the PREA Act, there was a commission that was established of all the states, the federal government, and Amtrak along the Northeast Corridor. And that's where the $21 billion backlog really came from, of the necessity for us to rebuild an equity investment in this corridor. We also have a requirement because of the growth of traffic on this corridor, and we're handling over 2,000 trains a day on the corridor, Amtrak does, is that we need more capacity, which means we need some new assets as well, some new tunnels into New York, another new bridge going into New York especially, and we need to fix this Baltimore choke point that we have along the corridor. So from my perspective, that's where the funding is really needed. We make safety decisions based on safety, and the infrastructure decisions were being made based on the available funds.
Thank you. Mr. Hart, I just can't understand, this is 2015, and we're still analyzing whether seatbelts would have made a difference. You know, I certainly agree with Congressman Capuano that all these cars, planes, they have shown that it works. And I don't understand why in 2015 we're still analyzing this. And in terms of people walking around in the train, I mean, people get up and walk on the plane too, right? But you take your life in your hands sometimes when you walk around these trains with back and forth. So, Mr. Hart, can you answer that? I mean, I just don't see why we have to analyze this anymore. We're analyzing this thing to what?
Thank you for the question. We're looking at the total situation, not just the seat belts, but also the integrity of the seats themselves. As Administrator Feinberg mentioned, there were several seats that came detached. So we're looking at the totality of circumstances regarding how to protect the occupants.
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, we're looking at the seats. It just seems logical to me that seat belts would make a difference. And to wait to analyze it more and more and more, I don't get it. I mean, I'd be comfortable wearing a seatbelt, and I go on that train Mondays and Tuesdays and Thursdays and Fridays. I don't see it. We have to wait for this. Ms. Weidner, can you talk to that?
In my experience, the NTSB is not shy about recommending improvements to safety. And so we will work closely with them, and anything that comes out of this accident, we will work very closely in.
Would you say this is one of the cheapest recommendations that you can make?
On seatbelts?
Yes.
No, I would not.
It's more expensive than all the other recommendations.
It is implementing seatbelts, and again, I'll be deferential to Mr. Hart here, but implementing seatbelts on trains would require the change of every seat, which would, again, expense is not the priority here, but we would have to harden all of the seats.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And that would cost billions of dollars. Is what
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Michael is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Hart, I have a copy of the Metro Link crash report from 2008. You're familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And in that, you had two recommendations, major recommendations. One, that we have cameras installed, inward-looking cameras.
Yes.
That was in 2008. And then you also had the positive train control recommendation, correct?
Yes.
I want to talk about both of those. First of all, let's go back to this 2008 report. If you just look at it, that wasn't the first time you recommended cameras or audio devices in the cab. Is that correct?
That's correct. It goes back several years before that.
In this report, you have 1997, after a 1996 crash and no operating crew members survived. That was an Amtrak train near Silver Springs, Maryland, February 16th, 1996. You recommended. And that's R97-9 recommendation. Then you had another accident with no surviving crew members that occurred in 1999 in Bryant, Ohio. Is that correct? And a recommendation, which is R97-9 to the FRA. The first one was to the NTSB, recommended to the FRA that they install these devices. Then the second one was back in 99. It says also recommended that the FRA install this. Then your recommendation in 2005, there was a crash of a CN freight trains in Anding, Mississippi. NTSB made the following recommendations to FRA. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, that's correct.
R07-3. What did FRA do, Ms. Feinberg?
Previously, the FRA has not taken action on inward.
They did not take an action on any of these. Okay, and then the 2008 was also a recommendation. They did not take an action on that either. Is that correct?
That is correct. Our recent actions on inward-facing cameras have been.
In fact, it's been very difficult. In fact, since then, many of the freight rails have installed those devices. Are you aware of that, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Yes. In fact, but it's been difficult. In fact, they've had to go through lawsuits. I want this to be entered into the record. Here's Kansas City Southern was attempting to put into cameras in the cab. They were sued by Mr. Comstock and his group. Not only will both unions fervently oppose KCS lawsuit, they will be asking the court to enjoin them from going ahead with the plan. Could we put that in the record, please? Okay. Ask unanimous consent.
Objections to
All
order.
right. That's cameras and a little bit of the history and nothing being done. Let's talk about finance this and positive train control. You just recommended you're going to have FRA financing available?
The RIF program does have financing
Yes,
available.
okay.
MTA has.
Since
gotten-
2012, how many RIF loans have there been?
I believe there have been 3.
Two up till this year, I think.
Well, a total of 3. The joke is there are more FRA administrators. We've had more FRA administrators than we've had RIF loans. So you have the capability to loan money. If you need adjustment in that, you need to get to us. In fact, the private sector has a responsibility for installing positive train control. They've actually run into some problems, haven't they, with FCC? So another government agency has actually delayed this. This is part of part of the problem was, I think, Native Americans and also approval by FCC of those requests for licenses. Isn't that the truth?
For the,
Yes.
for the
So it's not all the
antenna.
freight railroad. Some of it's been delayed. I'd like that submitted for the record to also show that there have been problems with FCC. In fact, do you know how many licenses FCC has done per year approved on average?
I do not know how many per year.
They do about 2,000 a year. Do you know how many the freight company have been required to have approved and get approved so they could get this stuff installed by the end of the year?
In terms of antennas?
It's 22,000. So
Correct.
there's a little bit of a backlog, and it's not right to penalize the freight rails for delays that are by an agency and things beyond their control. So when you say you're going to take them to task, I don't think that that's the right thing to do. Just getting started here, Mr. Chairman. Give me about 10 more. Yield back the balance of my time at this point.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Norton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The focus here has been on, of course, positive train control, because it does seem like such a silver bullet. I'm a little leery of silver bullets, and I note that Ms. Feinberg testified that human factors continue to be the leading cause, she says on page 6 of her testimony, of train accidents. I think this train was going at, what was it, 150 miles an hour at that curve?
102.
106? Now, Mr. Pierce, on page 6 of his testimony, says that although there's been concern about sleep disorder, he focuses on poor lineup information and far too many surprise calls for work. And he says we have identified these for more than a decade. Confirmed data also show that variable work cycles, where engineers move from shift to shift, routinely contribute to fatigue, yet very little has been done to address any of these issues. Mr. Boardman, on November 25th, I wrote you a letter concerning precisely the issues of fatigue. And I must ask you today, particularly considering that these very tracks carry volatile substances as well as passengers, I must ask you about the Amtrak proposal to reconfigure work schedules for train and engineer service employees at Union Station and in road service elsewhere on the Northeast Corridor. I would like to know if you are continuing to reconfigure these work schedules even after this accident, or whether you have stood down on those work schedules for the time being.
The route couplets that were changed along the Northeast Corridor remain, and the kinds of difficulties I believe that were testified to in terms of unpredictable work schedules doesn't really exist at passenger railroads. And unless there's unpredictable weather, or if we have a problem out somewhere on the long distance trains, there's a pretty predictable schedule that occurs for Amtrak engineers.
So you are mandating 12-hour shifts for T&E employees?
They're not mandated at 12-hour shifts. They have a period of time that they have between the work schedules that they have.
Mr. Pierce, let me ask Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, would you comment on what Mr. Boardman has said and on this notion of poor lineup and surprise calls to work, whether that continues and what the effect has been on workers.
My comments were inclusive of freight and passenger, and because freight and passenger, as you say, interact on the same tracks, we view that as a related issue. Amtrak jobs are scheduled, much more so than the freight environment. But there are cases where shift changes that come and people rotate from one shift to another do contribute to fatigue. Our comments were intended to at least note the things that can contribute to unsafe rail operations, and fatigue is one of those. It's been identified by the NTSB for a very long time, and it's something that we still try to continue to get our arms around.
Could I ask a witness from NTSB whether you're looking at fatigue along with the obvious absence of PTC, if you are looking at issues of possible fatigue? I'm concerned about this. I'm assuming we don't have people driving these trains who would just ordinarily go 100 and whatever miles around the curve. And I'm asking you if you're looking at what may have caused this engineer to be driving at excessive speed around this curve.
Yes, we typically look at fatigue in all accidents, and we are looking at it in this accident, and we have been recommending for years fatigue management programs that use science-based principles to determine issues like shift changes. We know that is difficult on the circadian flow of a person's body, so we've looked at that for quite a few years.
Have you looked at 12-hour work shifts as whether or not those are consistent with safety and these surprise calls?
We've looked at a number of methods of work shifts and of shift changes and made recommendations that these need to be based on science-based fatigue management programs to look at the total picture and base them on science.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boardman, I want a little clarity. I'm a little confused. On the PTC we talked about on this track, I think it was a conscious decision. Well, first of all, in your testimony, you said on southbound that was instituted. PTC was in place, right, positive train control. But on northbound, it wasn't, because I think I read a report that it was a decision that they probably couldn't get enough speed. And you said the maximum speed they could get up to was 80 miles an hour, and the derailment speed was 93, I think, in your testimony. Is that correct?
No, sir.
No, what was that?
It's not. It's not PTC, and it is not an acceleration. It's a maximum allowed speed is 80 miles an hour, and the turnover speed on the corner is 98.
No, I understand that, but I think I read in the report that the reason it was on the southbound, PTC was implemented on the southbound.
Excuse me, sir. I just want you to understand it's not positive train control. This is not positive train control that we're talking about here. It's automatic train control, which is a major difference on how it operates. That's all.
Oh, okay. So automatic train control is on the southbound track?
Yes, sir.
And not in the northbound track?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so when you were talking about the megahertz thing, that was different. That was with PTC, not automated?
When I was talking about?
When we were talking about the 900 megahertz? And
Yes, I was talking about positive train control there.
Okay, so we don't have, so for clarity here, there's no positive train control in the southbound. It's automated.
There's no positive train control on that at all. This is using a code coming out of the automatic train control. There's 4 codes.
Okay.
They were really made initially for not having one train run into each other on an automatic block system. I'm digging into a much deeper piece here, but it's not positive.
That's helpful. I'm just trying to understand this a little better. Also, since this was a new engine, does this train have the capability to gain speed faster than maybe it was previously thought?
The new ACS 64s have a different performance metric, just like we have 3 or 4 different kinds of locomotives that are out there that have different characteristics. So it wouldn't surprise me that it does.
Okay. I think back in 2013, in a hearing, you told Chairman Schuster what was the biggest priority for Amtrak was either a northeast corridor or long-distance services, and I believe you responded at long-distance services. In light of this accident, are you looking at revisiting that? I mean, the big question here today is why wasn't PTC implemented sooner on this highly traveled Northeast corridor? Were dollars reprogrammed to other areas of the country for long-distance services?
No, they weren't. We made decisions based on safety, and we knew what our scheduled time was, and the deadline was going to be December 31st of 2015. So we were working against that and resolving the problems that we moved along with on that process.
Okay. Mr. Pierce, in your written testimony, you talk about, you take issue with PTC replacing the second member of the crew in a cab. You got a number of accidents cited. In Chairman Hart's testimony, two-person crews were determined to PTC would have prevented them, not the two-person crew. Do you agree with that or not?
There is one example cited, I believe, at Red Oak, Iowa, that was not a PTC preventable accident. When two trains get into the same block, as we call it, of signal, there is no meaningful way for PTC to avoid collision in that circumstance. So we do not believe that PTC can actually replace the second crew member because it doesn't do what he does, and it isn't always going to prevent a train-to-train collision.
Okay.
The majority of them will be prevented, but not all.
Okay. Ms. Feinberg, do you have to institute PTC on the Northeast Corridor? Apparently it's not, where I thought some of it was. Billions of dollars cost?
I would defer to Amtrak on the actual cost because I think they've predicted it, but I think it's less than that just for the Northeast Corridor in terms of what they haven't implemented and how far they have to go to complete implementation.
Mr. Boardman?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the base question.
To put PTC, well, you said in my previous question that the PTC is not implemented at all in Northeast Corridor or parts?
It's installed. It's not activated because we needed that
megahertz.
radio frequency.
Okay, so how much? What's estimated cost to?
$111 million is where we are for that for the PTC on the Northeast
$111
Corridor.
million. Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses today. I know that, there's still a lot of facts and many more questions that we have to examine before we get some real answers, but there's some things, and I want to follow up with Ms. Norton's comments. On May 12th, my understanding, Mr. Pierce, is that the engineer who was operating was doing so under a new rule, under a new controversial work schedule that began on March 23rd of 2015, and that included shorter turnaround times on most runs that had happened than before March 23rd. And so I guess I'm just curious as to whether the union or the workers have been consulted prior to the implementation of this new work schedule as to what they believe the impact would be on them.
Yes, they have been. The unions are in discussions with Amtrak about the scheduling of the workforce on the assignments that you're talking about. The assignments as they're in place today, though, as I understand it, do not violate federal hours of service, and they are not restricted by the current contract language. It is something that the parties work out between themselves as to the best way to assign those jobs, and our representatives on Amtrak are the ones involved in those negotiations now.
And did you express concerns to Amtrak about the schedules or about the inclusion of the schedules in the new modeling for scheduling?
I know that our representatives have shared our concern over those schedules with Amtrak, yes.
And do you feel that that's been incorporated in the rule that's been in place?
I'm not sure I understand that last question.
Do you think that the concerns that you expressed about including the demands on scheduling issues that impact the workers have been appropriately included in the new work requirement?
I don't think the process is completed yet, so I can't really comment on what the final product will be. I know the parties are discussing it now as to what the appropriate assignment and the respite time should be between those runs.
And to Mr. Boardman, can you describe for us, if you would, how you incorporate fatigue as an element of the modeling when it goes into the work schedules?
I cannot.
What, you don't incorporate it in there, or you just don't
I
know?
can't describe if we have a modeling for fatigue in here. I know in this particular run, there were no changes. It was the same schedule.
Okay, but in developing the model, what is it that Amtrak does to incorporate worker fatigue, engineer fatigue in the model?
In terms of whether we would have sufficient rest for the employee, we ensure that that's the case. But having a model differently from a mathematical model, I'm not sure your question.
Okay, so Mr. Hart, when you examine what it is that of the number of things that may have gone wrong, how do you look at fatigue and how do you look at the modeling for work schedules?
We start with the 72-hour history of the person involved and look at what that reflects, and then if that commands us to dig deeper and find out what kinds of programs does the employer have that would result in the 72-hour pass that this employee encountered, then we would dig deeper. So we would start with the 72-hour history.
And Ms. Feinberg, have you, has the FRA engaged in a process of implementing recommendations, previous recommendations from the NTSB?
On this specific issue, we've done work on fatigue and generally for quite some time and are now in the midst of working on a comprehensive rulemaking that would address fatigue.
So when
other
recommendations,
issues.
because we've done this when there's been, there have been transit accidents and other things, when recommendations come from the NTSB, how do you decide if it's not a requirement, they're recommendations, how does the FRA decide whether it's going to implement them? Because it seems to me that many of these recommendations just kind of remain on a list forever until there's an accident, and then we look at the recommendations again.
Well, I wish it were as easy as the NTSB giving us recommendations and us just implementing them, but that just doesn't work that way. I mean, we have to enter into a rulemaking, or we would have to go into an emergency order, which probably wouldn't stand up in court. But I mean, generally, a lot of times we would have to enter into a rulemaking that would ultimately take years. I mean, there are occasionally some NTSB recommendations that we may not agree with, and Chairman Hart and I will write back and forth to each other. My predecessor would write back and forth to each other to talk about it, and our staffs will frequently work together to see if we can come together on it. But you know, when I arrived at the FRA, we had 72 outstanding NTSB recommendations. I have said that it's one of my top priorities to clear the deck. I think we're down to 63, and we meet weekly and work to clear the deck every single week.
My time has long expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. Mr. Hanna.
Thank you. Among other things, and there are members who would defund, cut back on Amtrak generally. This accident and this tragedy pointed out the importance of Amtrak, I think, in ways that we should observe. And I think, Mr. Boardman, maybe you can speak to that, because I view transportation of goods and people up and down the Northeast Corridor as a system. And what we noticed in those days, and you were back at work I thought very quickly, a matter of days, was a pressure on the highways, on aviation, an tremendous increase in some of those tickets and difficulties on the highway. I wonder if anybody if you, Mr. Boardman, maybe, and Ms. Feinberg would like to speak to that anecdotally.
Certainly, Mr. Hanna. I believe that you're right. I think that people understood, intellectually at first, that shutting down the railroad was going to cause a major economic blip for people that wanted to get to work, that needed to do business and conduct their work on that particular part of the railroad. And then I think they understood it after almost a week much more emotionally and in their pocketbook, because of the problems that occurred in that period of time. They could take 1 or 2 days, but when it became a shutdown for that period of time, their personal economy had suffered, and the mobility and the business community had suffered and was suffering from the increase in the number of cars that were on the highway, and in the inability to even find a seat by aviation between.
Right, I heard tickets over $2,000 from New York to D.C.
I read one of the articles where it was a pretty high level, and I think one of the things that the aviation people did say was the last seat is always much more expensive because of the way they price their services. But it was definitely a problem.
Ms. Feinberg?
If I'm remembering the numbers correctly, I think that NEC is a $100 million a day entity. And so anytime service is shut down on the NEC or a portion of the Northeast Corridor, it has a dramatic impact, which is why we're frequently talking about the importance of making sure that the Northeast Corridor is in a state of good repair and that we're working on the
And of
back.
course, we're fairly well concluded here that is not in a state of good repair.
That's right.
The 21 billion, the one bridge that's over 100 years old that pivots, that could shut down virtually everything. The plans are done. It could be built if it were funded, and that is a point in the system that could virtually wreck everything for a long, long time. So that $100 million a day in a week would be, 700 million, whatever.
And there are multiple choke points like that.
There are. Do you know others?
The tunnels underneath the Hudson, the Baltimore tunnel, it just depends on where, but there are multiple choke points like that.
Mr. Hart, just a quick question for you. You and Mr. Pierce have a disagreement about audio and inward-facing cameras. I can understand both points of view, but I would like it to give you a minute to maybe explain yours a little more thoroughly, because clearly you have a difference of opinion over privacy and what Mr. Pierce referred to as un-American.
Yes, thank you for the question. The more we know about what caused the crash, the more specifically we can recommend remedies to try to prevent it from happening again. And that's the additional information that we get from video and audio sources that helps us to be more specific about what caused the crash and then be more specific about our recommendations.
So would you say as a public servant, public employee, and engineer, that it's not too much to ask?
Well, Congress asked us to improve safety, and that's one of the ways we're trying to improve safety. We think that's a very important tool.
Want to respond
to
to, just to be fair?
I think our position on cameras has been somewhat misrepresented. The problem that we have with cameras is that there is no regulation or legislation in effect today that govern their installation. And railroads are running programs on their own that they've imposed or implemented without consultation from the labor unions or from the people who are being filmed.
So you think there's a way to do this that could accommodate everyone?
We have made, I don't know how many proposals, both through the RSAC process with FRA. We have met individually with each of the Class 1 freight railroads to try to come up with ways to have a reasonable implementation. We have not satisfied our goal yet.
My time's expired. Thank you, Chairman.
Ms. Frankel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, one of the great things about being sort of at the end of the questioning is to get to hear all the good ideas, and so this is what so far I've heard some suggestions for cameras, seat belts, hardening of the seats for the seat belts, modernizing the cars, more training, more employees, better infrastructure, positive train control. And I know that, and I join my colleagues in saying, extending sympathies to all the folks who lost loved ones and who are injured. And I know they're back home very angry, wanting to know why we can't do more or we don't do more. But I think it's pretty obvious that, you give billions of dollars of figures every time we mention one of these suggestions. So my question is, from a practical point of view, what do each of you recommend as the best way to proceed in that will keep train travel affordable, and recognizing that this Congress has put a sequester on itself?
Humans make mistakes. That's fundamental. The engineers are a very good population of people. They're hard-working try to do the right thing, but they make mistakes because they're humans. That's not criticism, that's just a statement of fact. Humans make mistakes. That's why positive train control is the most important single backup to respond to human error.
I'll stay on the positive train control for a minute, and I believe we will be done on the spine of the Northeast Corridor by the end of this year. That'll contribute the greatest leap in safety for the Northeast Corridor, and positive train control in this nation should be done by this generation of railroaders. In terms of the infrastructure on the Northeast Corridor, it is no different than what is happening to our interstate highway system and to our aviation system. We as a nation must begin to make an equity investment, even if we have to find other ways to do it with third parties, public-private financing. It has to occur for the future, or our economy will begin to suffer. That needs to happen.
In terms of human factors, positive train control is the game changer. Fatigue management and bringing our infrastructure up to a state of good repair.
I think the positive train control, because the only thing that's not a machine on a locomotive is the crew, and they are humans. And it would be like walking a tightrope without a net not to have PTC. And this comes down to a discussion over what level of risk we're willing to take as a nation and how we would fund avoiding that risk.
And can, whoever wants to answer this question, just for the public's purpose, could you explain what is the difficulty in getting positive train control? Is it just the cost? Is it getting the airwaves? Is it the technology? What is the biggest obstacles?
I'll take a first stab at it, at least. For Amtrak, it has been recently getting the spectrum of radio that we really need to ensure the reliability for a system that needs to be vital and needs to be fail-safe. And that has been the holdup. We've moved it quickly now with the FCC. The testing will occur, and we will get this done by the deadline on the Northeast Corridor.
So do you believe that the FCC has been responsive enough? Or could they be more helpful?
We think they've been very responsive in the last 3 weeks, yes.
But how long have you been trying to push this through?
We began to run into problems with this in around 2012 or thereabouts, that they began to point us to the private sector to buy the spectrum.
Mrs. Feinberg?
Funding is certainly an issue. Spectrum has been an issue. PTC is, look at it, it is a complicated technology. It requires, a back office. It requires the antennas, the spectrum, transponders, wayside. And it is a complicated technology, and it takes time. The FRA requires railroads to submit a safety implementation plan to us so that we can go over that plan with the railroads, provide edits and changes, and so that we can work together to get them to a place where they're able to implement it. We've received one safety plan from a railroad. It was more than 5,000 pages long, and it was appropriately long. So it is a massive undertaking. It's complicated and it's expensive. We were able to get back to that railroad and provide them with feedback so they can move forward and start implementing. But it is certainly complicated and expensive.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel. And before I recognize Mr. Rice, let me remind members that we have about 20 members waiting in line with 7 still before the gavel, and it is quickly approaching 12 o'clock. So if there are any members that would like to submit their questions in writing, this committee would be happy to accommodate them. Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, point of information.
Yes, sir, Mr. Nadler.
Did you just ask that members who may wish to submit their questions in writing, or are you limiting the right of people to ask questions aloud?
There is no, we are not dictating when this committee will adjourn. We're only saying if there are members that would like to, by choice, enter in questions in writing, we would certainly accommodate them.
Thank you.
Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start with Mr. Hart. Mr. Hart, we've talked about a number of safety measures that could be added that would increase safety on these lines, and some more expensive and some cheaper. We talked about the positive train control. We've talked about adding seat belts and having to bulk up the seats, and we've talked about inward-facing cameras, among others. Between those three, which would be the cheapest to implement, do you think?
We don't get into the cost of implementation. We just look at what will most effectively improve safety.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Mr. Boardman, which do you think would be the cheapest among those three?
Well, for us, because we'd already gotten the positive train control moving forward, it's not a great expense at this point in time in the overall part of it. But we don't think that the inward-facing cameras is an outrageous cost either. We think that's a more reasonable cost.
Pretty reasonably priced thing, right?
Yeah.
Why
it's not off the shelf.
Why would inward-facing cameras increase safety? I mean, they're just taking a picture.
Because we can use them for efficiency testing. We can see what's going on with the engineer itself. We've actually had...
You think they might change the behavior of the engineer some?
We have a pilot program, and we have a system that we operate now, Metrolink, where there is much less stress than what the engineers thought they were going to have. And actually, it's really helped a lot of situations.
Stress. Mrs. Feinberg, among those three, the seat belts, the inward-facing cameras, and the train control, which would be the cheapest to implement, do you think?
The most inexpensive would be inward-facing cameras. I think you probably get more bang for your buck with PTC, but we are moving forward with both.
Mr. Pierce, which one do you think would be the cheapest? Positive train control, inward-facing cameras?
I think the jury is out on inward-facing cameras. The technology that the freight railroads have adopted has not even been measured to crash worthiness standards. The technology failed in several collisions, so the data was not available. It didn't provide the post-accident testing that it's supposedly being provided for.
Why don't we have inward-facing cameras? I mean, it's been out, it's been recommended, it's been suggested. Ms. Feinberg, why don't we have those now?
Well, we do have inward-facing cameras now. Many of the Class 1s have already implemented inward-facing cameras.
Why don't we have them on all the trains? Why wasn't there one on this train?
Well, because some have chosen not to implement inward-facing cameras. What we're doing is moving ahead with the rulemaking, although we may take some interim steps to recommend inward-facing cameras and to also put
chosen
some
not to. Why haven't they been mandated?
Well, the issue has rarely been for us to mandate them. It's been that railroads are moving ahead with them regardless, and should we put some sort of guardrails around?
Why haven't they been mandated?
I don't have the answer to the mandate. We've been supporting that it occur in...
Supporting? Why haven't you required it?
In a conference... Well, I
mean,
did.
it would be very inexpensive to put a camera in the...
I have required it at this point. So the decision is we are doing that.
Why hasn't it been required up till now?
Because I did not make the decision myself to do that. We had been supporting the Rail Safety Advisory Committee and discussing how this should happen.
Who would have argued against putting in inward-facing cameras?
A lot has to do with how the data is going to be used and whether it's going to be appropriately used.
Well, you know, is it privacy issues with the engineers? Is that one of the issues?
I'd have to let the engineers answer that.
Mr. Pierce?
It is not only a privacy issue, it's just, as Mr. Boardman said, it's the way the cameras are being utilized and how they're being implemented. There are no safeguards, either legislative or regulatory.
Safeguards? All it's doing is taking a picture. It's not going to hurt anything. What do you mean safeguard? Why wouldn't they have an inward-facing camera? It's a cheap way to increase safety. Why would they not have an inward-facing camera?
You're suggesting that we're going to change behavior, and that suggests that there's intentional bad behavior, and I would argue that that's inappropriate or not an accurate representation. The bottom line is
I mean, we've had proven cases of bad behavior. 2 years ago, there was a driver who said he fell asleep, I believe, going into a curve, and people were killed. We don't know what happened in this case.
I don't consider fatigue bad behavior, Congressman.
Well, I would think if they're on camera, they might be a little more aware of their surroundings.
I do not think a camera will cure fatigue. It will not make you less tired if you are tired.
I suspect that it would be a great increase in safety in terms of changing behavior. I want to ask one more question. Mr. Hart, you said that you were looking at phone data for the last 3 weeks, including changes in, it was complicated by changes in time zones. How many time zones do you cross in Philadelphia on this line?
Mr. Hart, I would ask for a quick response.
Yes, the time zones we're talking about is the time zones in the phone system, because it's a California-based carrier phone with California numbers, and so the time zones we're talking about are the time zones in the phone, not the time zones that the train passed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boardman, I wanted to ask, I feel pretty confident based on your testimony that at least for the Northeast Corridor, that you're going to be able to complete PDC in a timely way by 2015. I wanted to know whether you believe we have the resources and technology for Amtrak at least to complete PDC across the country by 2015.
Well, Amtrak doesn't have the responsibility to actually implement the PTC across the country on host railroads for the most part. There have been a couple of Class 3 railroads that believe, one in Kansas City and the other one in St. Louis, that believe that we need to be the ones to implement positive train control in those communities. The rest of it is primarily the Class 1 railroads, and our part would be to implement it in our locomotives. And we'll be ready, we believe, when they have their positive train control available.
So Amtrak in California, for example, you're saying you're not responsible for PDC there?
Yeah, if it's not our line,
I see.
We're not responsible.
Okay. Ms. Feinberg, in terms of implementation, are there any penalties that would be imposed for railroads that have not met the PTC implementation?
We have significant discretion in how we would impose penalties, but we are having an internal conversation at FRA now about how we will go about enforcing against the deadline.
And when will you complete that task and the public would know?
It's in the coming weeks, I would say.
In the coming weeks. And Ms. Feinberg, I also wanted to follow up with you just in terms of your opinion in lieu of sort of full implementation of PTC. Do you think two-person crews is something that would be an appropriate safety net for the short term? It doesn't sound to me like there's going to be full implementation by 2015. Certainly the airlines have 2 crew members. Do you think that that's something that could be a short-term or interim safeguard?
Certainly, that is one of the things that we're taking a close look at and that we believe could be an interim solution, along with probably some additional backstops as well. And there are some places where that two people in the cab may not be possible, but you could have additional folks on the train communicating back and forth to each other.
And why would 2 people in a cab not be possible in some instances?
There's not room.
Just not enough room. And Mr. Hart, is just also the same question to you. Do you believe that a 2-person crew might be an interim solution before PTC is fully implemented?
Our experience is limited. It would be based on our accidents, and there haven't been that many 2-person crews, but from that limited experience, we don't find that 2-person crews are an improvement over single-person crews.
And why is that? I mean, it just seems to me common sense that if you have another 2 people driving a train, that if one person falls asleep, then the other person is there to take over.
In theory, that's true, but 2 people can fall asleep, 2 people can be distracted. We're not finding from experience, and again, the experience is limited because we don't have that many 2-person crews, but based on our limited experience in this and other modes, we're not finding 2-person crews to be an improvement, safety improvement over single-person crews.
Thank you, sir. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Brownlee. Mr. Perry.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Is my understanding you'd like me to yield some time to you?
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Just one quick question for Ms. Feinberg. Safety is obviously important across the entire country, and in my home state of California, PTC has been slow to be implemented as well. $3.7 billion was put to California high-speed rail. That money has now been transferred to the Caltrain to electrify Caltrain. It has been transferred to the Transbay Terminal, $400 million of that to help implement that Transbay Terminal. Why are we not transferring money to do PTC on the connector routes in California?
We have asked for significant funding for PTC implementation for the commuters. If you're asking specifically if we would transfer money from the High-Speed Rail Authority into PTC?
You're using stimulus dollars in many different places in California for electrification and for changing the terminal, but yet not using it for PTC, which it's my understanding high-speed rail will need PTC. These connector routes should have PTC already. Why are we not using the money that is going to revert back to the federal government next year if it's not spent? If that money is available today, why are we not using it for PTC in California?
Well, it will be going to PTC in California. I mean, much of the ARA money that has gone out, I think $600 million of it has gone towards PTC.
So you're saying it's a priority, you just haven't been able to spend it quick enough in California?
No, I believe that it will get spent on time by the end of the year.
Okay, just for the record, we're spending California high-speed rail dollars, federal stimulus dollars, on many different areas in California to do other things. We're far behind on PTC, and it has not been a big enough priority to use those stimulus dollars on PTC in California.
Sir, if you're asking if we can take stimulus dollars that is going to high-speed rail and transfer it to PTC, I don't believe that would be in keeping with the grant agreement, but we can certainly take a look at it and come back to you with a formal response, but I don't think that would be in keeping with the grant agreement.
Back to Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reclaiming my time. Ms. Feinberg, just want to establish something. There's been an assertion, or at least an implication made in this committee that Congress itself and maybe certain individuals or certain party are responsible financially for the mishap, the accident in Philadelphia. And so I just want to get the facts straight. It's my understanding as well that FRA has stated that a lack of public sector funding may cause unwanted delays in fully implementing PTC. And it also, according to my records, would cost about $131.2 million, $131.2 million to fully implement positive train control on the Northeast Corridor, the track that Amtrak owns. Now, over 12 years, they lost over $1 billion in food service. It's also the Inspector General's opinion that Amtrak paid large bonuses to ineligible management and staff. The 31 million Amtrak tickets sold last year were subsidized by the taxpayers at the tune of $42 to $350 a piece. And this particular portion of the line makes anywhere from $400 to $500 million a year. It seems to me, plus we give Amtrak, the taxpayers fund Amtrak at the tune of 1.3 to whatever 2-point-something billion dollars a year. How come they can't spend 10% of what they lost in food service on positive train control? And is it Congress's fault that positive train is it FRA's assertion that it's Congress's fault that PTC wasn't funded in the Northeast Corridor?
Well, on Amtrak, Amtrak has said that they will implement PTC by the congressionally mandated deadline of December 31st, 2015, and we believe that we agree with them that they can meet that deadline.
So it's not a funding issue?
Amtrak does not have a funding issue in terms of PTC. They have said that they will meet the deadline.
Amtrak, just to be clear, Amtrak does not have a funding issue with PTC by the deadline. So it's not Congress's fault that it's not implemented timely, correct or not correct?
Amtrak specifically has said that they will meet the deadline.
Right.
We have had many conversations about the need for, or our request of the Congress to give additional assistance to commuter railroads to meet the deadline. We've also requested additional assistance for Amtrak to meet the deadline.
One last question, Mr. Chairman. Before I came here, I think about 2009, $800 billion in stimulus was passed, and the majority of it was to go to infrastructure. If PTC was such a concern, how much was spent of the $800 billion, understanding that $131.2 million, a very small percentage, if you look at that, would be required to fully implement PTC in the Northeast Corridor? How much was spent, allocated by this Congress? How much was spent on PTC if it's such a priority? Do you know?
Ms. Feinberg, I'd ask for a quick response.
We'll have to get back to you with how much of that was.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I think it's.
Ms. Brown, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As former ranking member of Railroad Subcommittee and a strong supporter of rail, my heart goes out to the families and individuals who suffer in the wake of the Amtrak train derailment that occurred recently in Philadelphia. I personally want to thank today's panelists for their hard work and dedication and the employees that they've shown during the terrible disaster. Mr. Boardman, I want to particularly thank you for your leadership, but my question, I know that you all monitor the trains and the rates of the speed. Can you discuss what safeguards that you have in place to check the speed of your locomotives and engineers?
Yes, ma'am. We have a regular series, and I don't think you were here earlier when I said that we looked and we've checked the speed of, we've had 16,000 checks of speed since January 1st of 14. We do that through radar with our road foreman, and we do that by downloading the equipment in the locomotive to find out what speed they're traveling.
Yes, sir. I was here during the entire time.
Okay.
And I heard it. I just wanted you to repeat it again.
Thank you. Yes,
Positive train control. That is one of the most important aspects of safety. But we talked about the cars itself, and we talked about the crew. It's a combination. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Certainly. Positive train control is a system that's layered on top of several systems that we operate today, one of them being automatic train control. And we even go back, and every time there's a temporary speed change, we use a manual system called Form D control system, because the dispatcher and the engineer has to write down what has occurred here. So we use all the way from the manual system all the way up to a positive train control system in order to ensure that we operate safely, and we do run a safe railroad.
Mr. Hart, other than positive train control and the cameras, the facing cameras, what are some of the other safety measures do you think we need to put in place?
We've heard, thank you for the question. We've heard lots of talk about fatigue, and we're looking into that. The infrastructure is always an issue in terms of the maintenance of the state of good repair. We always are looking at that. So we're looking at the totality of circumstances. The best situation is for the train to stay on the track in the first place, so we want to make sure that happens. And then we want to provide survivability for the passengers if the train doesn't stay on the track.
Mrs. Feinberg, you know, you all acted quickly, and I want to thank you all for that. Do you think there's additional training that the employees need?
That is something that we're taking a look at now. When I referred to the package that we're putting together that would address potential human factors, that's something that we'll be taking a close look at.
Mr. Pierce, what are some of your concerns about the training of employees for a disaster? And I want to commend that the employees did an excellent job. You know, it was being monitored. I started getting calls as soon as it happened, and I want to thank you for that. But what additional training do you think the employees need for disaster?
I think the training that the employees receive is in large part the normal operations type training. Disaster training is obviously something that we don't hope we'll ever have to experience. I'm not sure exactly to what extent the difference is as to how much actual accident type training that the employees are receiving on Amtrak right now. I'd have to defer to Mr. Boardman on that one.
Mr. Boardman?
So what Amtrak does today is has an emergency management system. We're working in concert with first responders up and down the corridor and across the country with police departments, and we have an incident command structure. There was a requirement in the PREA law that we have a family assistance program. We work with the NTSB to make sure that we stand that up properly, and so we depend on those first responders in the communities such as, and I talked about it earlier, Philadelphia in this particular case, but we have an ongoing good relationship with them, with the FRA, and with NTSB to make sure we have the proper training and disaster drills across the country.
My time is running out, but what I would like from each of the members in writing, what are some of the infrastructure projects that we need in the northeast corridor, like the Baltimore tunnels and other things, to make sure that we in Congress are doing what we need to do? Because when my colleagues try to imply that money is not an issue, money is an issue. And some of the tunnels, and we went up on the train and we talked to people along the way, and we know that there are many tunnels and infrastructure conditions that need to be upgraded.
Mr. Boardman, I ask for a quick response.
We will provide that list for you, Congresswoman.
Thank you. Mr. Rakita, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I would like it from not just Mr. Boardman, but I would like it from Mr. Hart, Mr. Feinberg, and Mr. Pierce. What are some of the infrastructure changes do they think needs to happen on that northeast corridor?
We will provide each of you with the questions in writing, but we would ask for a response on infrastructure needs from each of you. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. Rakita, recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. I thank the witnesses for their testimony this morning. Following up on some questions that might have already been asked, I want to go to you, sir, about the what seems to be, I think, in your testimony, a right to privacy in the locomotive cab with regard to inward-facing cameras. Is that the position of the Brotherhood or not?
I didn't say right to privacy. There are privacy concerns about the storage of data. I don't think anybody in this room wants to see their last minutes if they are killed in a locomotive collision floating around on YouTube, to be quite honest with you. There are steps that need to be taken to make sure that the data is protected and that the data is used for what everybody seems to think it should be used for, which is post-accident testing.
Right. It seems like that's covered in other modes of transportation and other industries. Surely that can be worked out. You agree, right?
To date, it has not been worked out. There is no regulation. FRA has started the rulemaking process on cameras, but until there is a regulation, the railroads are running programs, each one independent of the other, and the data storage is something that's different on every railroad.
Right. But however gruesome the photo or whatever the situation might be or whatever goes on YouTube, when you're on the job, you don't agree that there's a right to privacy, do you?
Well, you're kind of putting words in my mouth. Our concerns are many, but...
It's a yes or no question. I mean, I think you might have answered it already. You don't agree that there's a right to privacy, correct?
I don't see it as a yes or no answer. It's more complicated.
There is a right to privacy when you're on the job in a locomotive cab.
There should be a reasonable application of the installation of cameras, and we're willing to pursue one. We have not been afforded that opportunity yet.
Do airline pilots have a right to privacy in anything recorded on the black box or anything in the ATC communications or anything like that?
It's my understanding that FAA actually made a presentation to the RSAC group about the model that the airline industry uses, and that was at our recommendation because we would embrace that. It has not been offered to us.
Okay, but you'd embrace it if that was the case?
Yes.
Okay, great. Following up on Congressman Perry's line of question on the $800 billion spent on stimulus projects or other things regarding, I'm sorry, got a head in the way. Mr. Boardman, do you have any experience or recollection or any kind of numbers to give us regarding how much of that $800 billion was spent on PTC on your railroad?
$800 billion?
Yeah, part of the stimulus package.
No.
Of any of the money that or any of the subsidized money that was given.
$800 billion is not a number that rings with me. That of course, Amtrak would love to have $800 billion. Don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but no.
Any stimulus funds whatsoever? How much was spent on PTC in your estimation?
We did not spend any stimulus money on PTC per se, unless there was some particular part of another project
Why
that we're
not?
doing.
It's been the clear
because
testimony.
that wasn't what it was used for. It was looking for real investment in the Niantic Bridge, for example, and also rebuilding a whole section
Was
of
there
our
a legal
railroad.
prohibition against using?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Was there a legal prohibition in your in your experience against using stimulus funds? For,
They were really looking for infrastructure projects.
was there a legal prohibition? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay. And Ms. Feinberg, can you add anything to that? Do you think there's a legal prohibition against using stimulus funds for PTC?
I'm sorry. I don't think that there is a legal prohibition against, I don't think so.
Why do you think we didn't, or why do you think we didn't use funds for PTC if that's the case? Or do you have any estimation of the amount of stimulus funds that might have been used in any
To
kind
be
of
honest,
PTC work?
to take this, all of the stimulus dollars and give it to Amtrak and Class 1s to implement PTC, I'm not sure that that was something that occurred to anyone. I don't think it was even discussed.
Really? Because it's being discussed like it's a no-brainer, high priority that has been wanting to be done for decades, since 1969. And no one, this never occurred to anyone that you might use some of these funds
Well,
for that?
it was the Congress that mandated the implementation of PTC by the deadline that we're approaching now.
Right.
I do not know if it was a subject that you all discussed at the time.
No, I'm asking if you discussed it. Did anyone in the industry? The industry and the regulators are all testifying here today that this was such an important provision whose concept came about in 1969, I think, is what Ranking Member DeFazio stated. So in all that interim time and then having the stimulus money, no one thought to use that money for PTC? Or, and my question is, if so, how much was used for PTC?
Ms. Feinberg, we'd ask for a quick response, but this is another one that we would ask in writing with all of the stimulus dollars. Why wasn't PTC a priority during that spending?
And Mr. Chairman, if you can get a date from the witnesses as to when they can respond.
Absolutely, we'll get that at the final testimony.
If we can get it on the record, that'd be great.
Ms. Feinberg, do you care to have a quick response?
I'm sorry. Yes, we're happy to get that to you all.
Thank you. Mr. Adler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Boardman, of the $800 billion in stimulus funds, isn't it true that Amtrak got about $1.1 billion total?
I'm sorry, sir. I wanted
Of the $800 billion in stimulus funds, $240 billion of which was tax cuts, not spending, by the way. Isn't it true that Amtrak was allocated $1.1 billion? So we're talking about $1.1 billion, not $800 billion?
I think it was 1.4, 1.3.
$1.3 billion. And the total cost of and that was basically Congress instructed you to spend that on projects that were ready to go as fast as possible, infrastructure projects. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you spent it on what in broad terms?
Niantic River Bridge and some additional infrastructure projects.
Some infrastructure bridges and so forth, which I assume, had you not spent it on those, there would have been safety problems?
Yes.
Okay. So the basic, okay, thank you. Now, Amtrak has requested $36.4 million to implement PTC in fiscal year 2016. Now, does this go beyond finishing the implementation of PTC by the end of this calendar year?
Yes. This is off the Northeast Corridor. This isn't on the spine of the corridor. The spine of the corridor will be done by the end of December, but we have other work that we need to get done.
Okay. And could Amtrak have implemented PTC sooner if it had more federal funds?
Had they come a while ago, yes, but not now.
No, but if Amtrak had had more federal funds a year, 2, 3, 4 years ago, it could have implemented.
When we first started, if we'd had a dependable amount of money to move forward, yes.
Okay. Now, to switch topics for a moment, the tunnels into New York have been described as ticking time bombs because of damage from salt water during Hurricane Sandy. What's the status of those tunnels? What would happen if they were to go out of service, and how much funding is necessary to prevent that from happening?
Well, we found out this winter what would happen if they went out of service because we had so much ice that we had regular ice patrols that had to knock down the ice in one of the tubes or one of the other tubes. And when that happened, you went from being able to move 24 trains an hour down to 6 trains an hour. So we got a lot of complaints from New Jersey Transit and from Amtrak riders that they had to wait outside one of the tubes in order to get into New York City. So that's exactly what
Now,
is.
going from 24 trains an hour to 6 trains an hour as the only rail access into New York City from New Jersey would have a significant effect on the economy?
Absolutely.
Can you quantify that at all?
I will for you. I'll get back to you with that answer.
Please. And now I understand that Amtrak has a $21 billion backlog of projects on the Northeast Corridor just to achieve a state of good repair. Is that accurate?
That's what the commission developed and produced, yes.
Do you have any source of funding for that $21 billion?
No more so than what we get each year.
And how much is in the budget that the House just passed?
1.39 was what we had last year, and I think...
No, but that's for total. That's not just for projects on the NEC.
No, not for just the projects in
So
the NEC.
of the $21 billion necessary to get up to a state of good repair in the Northeast Corridor, how much was appropriated for that purpose or available for that purpose from the amount of funds voted by the House a couple of weeks ago?
There were some dollars that were specifically identified for advancing our gateway system, but not capital dollars for us to actually build it.
No capital dollars at all. Okay, so 0 over 21. That's a pretty good ratio. Now, we have heard that, Ms. Feinberg, we have heard that Amtrak will have the PTC, positive train control, in place by the end of the year, at least on the spine, a little later elsewhere. But what's the status of PTC implementation on other passenger rail lines like Metro North or Long Island Railroad in New York and other commuter rails? And what will it take for commuter lines such as those in the New York area to meet the deadline?
They're struggling. They're very much struggling to meet the deadline. We just completed a loan to the MTA for almost $1 billion to assist with their PTC implementation. That is not to reach the deadline. That will go beyond the deadline. But
and do we have any estimate as to when the commuter rails across the country are likely to be able to implement PTC?
It varies dramatically, but I would say anywhere from 16 to 18 to 20.
In other words, a year to 2 to 4 years after the deadline, and we know the possible safety repercussions. Let me just say that the Transportation Appropriations Bill on the floor this week includes no money for commuter lines, such as Metro North and the LIRR, to install PTC. Amtrak funds this out of federal capital grants, which were just cut by $290 million. Despite the fact that there's a $21 billion backlog to achieve a state of good repair in the NEC, we spend about $50 billion on highways and about $16 billion on $17 billion on aviation and $1.2 billion on rail. There's something very wrong with the appropriations process. And for us to sit here and not understand that the fact that Congress has been starving Amtrak has a large role to play in what we're talking about is putting our heads in the sand. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. Mr. Costello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with Ms. Feinberg, and I want to thank you for your time and attention the day following the tragedy when Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Capuano, and myself went and visited the site. My question to you relates to 49 CFR Part 220, restrictions on railroad operating employees' use of cellular telephones and other electronic devices. The final rule in which the Secretary essentially delegated to you the duties to exercise the authority to prohibit the use of personal electronic devices that may distract employees from safely performing their duties. The FRA study found railroad operating employees were increasingly using distracting electronic devices in a manner that created hazards. And I'm going from the Federal Registrar dated Monday, September 27, 2010. And I found this part particularly interesting, and it forms the basis of my question. Relating to access to employees' personal cell phone records, FRA has decided that a provision mandating that railroads require operating employees to provide access to personal cell phone records in the event of an accident is unnecessary for FRA purposes. Instead, FRA currently uses its investigative authority to obtain personal cell phone records when appropriate. Is that what you're doing now? In other words, it's through your investigative arm, not that's how you're getting to the personal cell phone records?
That's correct. So following the accident, we just subpoenaed those records.
And in looking at, and we've talked a little bit about inward-looking cameras, I think is the term. If you had inward-looking cameras, would the operating engineer, at that point in time, you'd be able to ascertain whether or not a personal cell phone was being used, correct?
That's one of the purposes of an inward-facing camera.
Is there concerns that without the inward-facing camera there, I did also go through this rule in detail, there are times throughout a ride when it would be a legitimate, an operating engineer would legitimately be able to look at their personal cell phone?
The regulation is that the phone should be off and stored.
Should be, right. Okay. If we had an inward-facing camera, we would know already if that were the case.
Yes, and the inward-facing camera, I think, would also provide us information after an accident, which would be useful.
Right.
So we wouldn't be needing to have this debate at the moment.
And so my question next turns to Mr. Pierce. I understand that you were, I think, making a distinction between privacy concerns and a right to privacy. I sort of intuited that from some of your testimony and some of the questions that you were answering. Can you talk a little bit more about this reasonable implementation? Because I'm a little concerned when we're talking about the privacy concerns of an individual operating engineer who would be taped while they're in the performance of their duties, because essentially you have to balance that against the public safety considerations of the 200 or 300 plus passengers who are in the train. And I think a lot of us are concerned that your testimony seems to suggest that we need to really focus on the privacy concerns of the operating engineer and not some of the public safety assurances and some of the information that would be elicited if you had the inward-facing cameras moving forward. So I want to give you an opportunity to sort of share with me a little bit more, or share with us a little bit more, what it is about these privacy concerns that you hold so dear on behalf of your membership.
Well, thank you. I do want to first comment about the comments that were made earlier about litigation when cameras started. The unions didn't actually go to court to block cameras. KCS Railroad took us to court to install them. So I think the record needs to be clear on who actually started a litigation effort in order to install cameras. The cameras installed so far in the country have been on freight railroads, primarily on Class 1 properties. And those cameras run 24/7, whether the train is moving, whether the train is stopped, and we have crew members that could sit on a train for up to 6 hours without moving. We've asked that the railroad shut the cameras off if there's no safety-sensitive duties being performed, and they've refused. That is a privacy concern.
Okay, but what about when it's operating?
Right now, they run 24/7. The parts that we have taken exception to, I'm trying to identify. We haven't said that there should be an outright prohibition. We've said that the implementation has been done in a way that there are disputes over it.
Do you believe that there is a sound public policy in favor of having an inward-facing camera on the operating engineer at all times during the moving of a passenger rail?
I know that that's where the industry is headed.
That could be a yes or no answer.
Well, but just so you know, all of the activities of the engineer are already recorded on an event recorder through the technology of the control stand. All we're going to get is a picture of what he does. We already know, with the exception of the cell phone use, what he does.
See, my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to round out the point on funding, well, first of all, Ms. Feinberg, congratulations on being named the future administrator. I want to point out that throughout this process and my time on the committee, you've been exceptionally responsive, incredibly helpful to us in so many ways, and I'm very excited to see that you're going to be continuing in this role. On the point on funding, the point is that in the Grow America Act, you included $800 million for commuter rail systems to help them speed up the implementation of PTC, right?
Correct.
The point is, it's not just Amtrak we're worried about. We're worried about all kinds of commuter systems that aren't going to have the money to do this on time, right?
Correct.
In fact, Amtrak's the only one that has their act together on this, right?
Amtrak is the only one that has their act together. I'd say Metrolink is also in good shape, and SEPTA is impressive.
Right. So one of the great tragedies of this accident is that the fact is that Amtrak is in the best position of all of the major rail systems we're concerned about to implement this life-saving technology. And there are real and important questions about what happened here and why. But among them is not some issue of Amtrak lagging behind other systems in its implementation of PTC. Isn't that right?
That's correct. They're ahead of everyone else.
And isn't it therefore beside the point to talk about what Amtrak is doing with respect to the federal funding? The point is that the federal funding is absolutely critical for the other systems like Metro North, where the Spuyten Duyvil crash we know would have been prevented by PTC. And I want to thank you again for approving a $1 billion, $960 million loan for Metro North to get that system moving faster with the installation of PTC, right? And in fact, you worked with us closely on my legislation included in the passenger rail bill with the assistance of Mr. Denham and others, so that we could make explicitly clear that RIF funding is available for all these systems because money's the issue, right?
Correct.
Right. And of all the people who ought to be apologizing for these accidents that keep happening because we don't have the safety systems in place, the United States Congress maybe ought to be at the top of that list. Wouldn't that be fair to say?
I think that would be fair to say.
And I think that when Mr. Boardman comes in here, who is clearly heartsick over this episode and who is doing everything he can and is going to meet this deadline and expresses his heartfelt regret, it might be nice if somebody on this committee expressed the heartfelt regret of the United States Congress for not having its act together in this area and so many others, where the safety of the American people is being compromised because we are dithering instead of investing in our own country. Isn't that fair to say?
Yes.
Thank you. And we've got 30 accidents and 69 deaths and 1,200 injuries, and this is the first one on Amtrak because we haven't had one on Amtrak like this in a quarter century. Isn't that right?
That's right.
So where the funding is most needed is where most of the deaths and most of the injuries are occurring. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
Thank you. So much for whether funding matters for safety. Now, I just have a couple of specific questions. Mr. Boardman, maybe you can help me out. You said that the northbound trains approach at 80 miles an hour in this junction, and the southbound trains approach at 110 miles an hour. And so they installed a system where they knew they had to slow down at least to get to the derailment speed of 98 on the southbound side. But isn't, in fact, the required speed through that corner 45 miles per hour when you slow down? In other words, you don't just slow down to a speed equal to or less than the derailment speed. You actually go down about half of it, right?
Yeah, we go down to a 50-mile-an-hour speed for a safety measure from the 98.
And so can you help me understand then, if that's the case, the recommended speed going northbound, even though the approach is below the derailment speed, it's not recommended that you take it at 80, even though you won't derail till 98, right?
No, and we've been going around that corner since the 30s in this same construct that's there without this code.
But at what speed should an engineer take that corner?
50 miles an hour.
Northbound,
Yeah.
50. And so it was just an oversight not to put the ATC system there to force the reduction in speed to 50?
No. What had happened because of the Back Bay incident, the entire community of safety folks, along with the regulator, looked at what was reasonable for us as an industry to do, and that what was reasonable is to make sure that we put in 6 locations a code change, because the only code change you could really do was down to 45 miles an hour, and that was where you were approaching at a speed that would overturn the train in the corridor.
Okay, I see.
And not the other way.
And that's what we're working on now. Is we're just going to close that gap. Last question, in just a couple seconds left, Mr. Hart. Could you just tell us again in plain English why we don't know whether this operator was on the phone 3 weeks after the accident? You said it was a time zone issue. Can't we just get the records? I mean, do we have the records? And if so, wouldn't we know whether he's on the phone?
We do have the records. The engineer was very cooperative. He even gave us the password to his cell phone. So we do have all that. As we peeled the onion, we found more and more complicated issues relating to the fact that the text was on one time zone, the voice is on another time zone, the carrier has all the time zones. So it turned out to be far more complicated than anybody anticipated.
But we will be able to determine, beyond peradventure, whether the phone was being operated at the time of the accident or shortly before.
Yes.
And when do you
be able to coordinate that with a number of different time sources to make sure to verify the accuracy of it? Because that's very, very crucial to get that right, obviously.
All right. Well, and thank you, sir, for the extraordinary work your agency does. I've seen it up close in the Metro North crash, and it's really extraordinary how professional and how efficient you guys are. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Ms. Comstock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on that. After 3 weeks, I have to say I am very frustrated that we don't have a timeline today in any way, shape, or form. And to the extent we have one, indicates the train departed at 9:10, and then the crash is at 9:21. So in terms of the phone records, to follow up on that, since the requirements say that it should be turned off and stored, do we know if the phone was turned off and stored during that 9:10 to 9:21 timeframe?
What we know is that there was use of the phone on that day, May 12th. What we don't know is that's what we're trying to narrow down to get the specifics of your question.
Okay, but I just texted back my daughter, yes, I can babysit on Friday, 11:42. That's on my phone now. Now, if it was a California phone, I guess it might say 8:42, and then you could figure it out. 3 weeks after, why can't we take those 11 minutes and have a timeline? I think for the victims and the families to have that type of information, I just don't understand what the holdup is.
We had no idea that it would be this complicated when we started down this path either. It's been far more complicated than any of us anticipated to be able to not only get the records from that phone, but then also to verify with the other sources.
But was the device turned off?
Because
if the device was turned off, then you could not have used it between 9:10 and 9:21.
We're determining, one of the things we'll determine in the timeline in that day is when was the device turned on, when it was turned off.
Just given the 3 hours in California, your timeline would have certain limits. If he hadn't used the phone within certain hours, you would know whether it's possible or not. Like if my phone said 8:42 instead of 11:42, then you'd know there was an issue. But if it said 7:42, then you'd know it's not possible. So I'm just trying to understand why this is so complicated.
Well, for example, we found discrepancies within the carrier's own time systems where it didn't even agree with itself. So we've got a lot to work out that was far more complicated than we anticipated.
How much would it cost us to not allow an engineer to have a phone in the cabin?
I couldn't speak to that question.
Would it cost anything?
We don't deal in the cost ramifications. We're looking at the safety.
My understanding is the regulations say that the railroads have the right to implement their own more stringent rules. Why can't we today just say you are not allowed to have your personal devices in the cabin, period? Just like when we go to classified briefings, it's not a trust system, we can't bring it in. Why can't we do that today?
I would defer on that question to Ms. Feinberg.
Railroads can certainly put that into place.
That would not be a cost issue, would it?
I would not think so.
Okay, would you all feel safer if someone did not have a device? We wouldn't be 3 weeks later trying to tell people whether or not they had a device and were using it at that time?
Well, it would certainly make our investigation easier if we didn't have to look into this, but we do have to look into it, and we routinely do now.
But if we implemented a policy that just said, don't have the devices in there, period. If you need to use a device, you step out of the cabin, you do whatever, you use it when you're stopped, but it cannot physically go in there. Is there an issue about why isn't that done?
Again, I'd have to defer to the regulators and to the railroads on that.
Does anyone think there would be a cost related to removing personal devices from the cabin?
Use of the devices is already prohibited. You're talking about an additional prohibition, but I'm sure that the NTSB would also investigate compliance with that prohibition, just like they do with today's prohibition.
Okay, and what kind of compliance issues are there? Right? What kind of spot checks are there right now to know whether or not, short of an accident, whether someone's using their phone or texting during their time in the cabin?
Certain locomotives now are equipped with cell phone detection equipment. It can be detected.
Did this cabin have that? Detection, so that they could detect it?
I don't know the answer to that at this point, but
Well, it seems like the no-cost safety solution here is today to say, just don't bring them in.
What's detectable is the signal in and the signal out. What's not detectable so easily was somebody manipulating the phone but not actually sending a signal at that moment.
But you did find the cell phone was in the cabin that day.
Yes.
And was it turned off or not?
Do not know the answer to that.
Does anybody know if it was turned on or off? Okay, how could we not know that at this point? That's the regulation, so if it was on, that was a regulation violation.
I don't
right?
know if that's not known. I'm saying I don't know it at this moment.
Does anybody here with any of the witnesses today know that?
I mean, I would just say that as, you know, the NTSB leads the investigation, we partner with them, and we also do our own investigation. There has not been a concern on the FRA's part that we will not figure this information out. It's a little complicated.
I
more
understand the
complicated than-
complication, but this is something that's so easy to find out quickly, and then we could know, like this action could have been taken the day after. Hey, until we know there was a cell phone in there, why don't we just say, you're not going to bring your cell phones in the cabin anymore? Because unless someone can tell me there's a safety concern about not having, I mean, my grandfather worked on the railroads for 40 years, and he safely worked on them for 40 years without a cell phone. So I'm just trying to figure out, is there a cell phone issue here that you need to have it in the cabin for safety purposes?
Generally, this time's expired. We will present these
Okay,
questions in writing as well.
Mr.
Turn off her microphone.
Safety concerns and where we're doing these things, these no-cost issues, we're sitting around there for 3 weeks not doing something.
We will develop a very precise timeline.
Ms. Generally, this time's expired. Ms. Testi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our panelists today for your hard work. As a representative from Connecticut, I have to say, you know, the folks I represent are concerned. And we're talking about thousands of people in my district who ride the lines every day to get to work. And so it is in our shared interest for their safety and also for the integrity of the system. I mean, when we talk about numbers of deaths, confidence in the system is vital. So I want to start in part with that, and again, extend my congratulations to you, Ms. Feinberg. You've been exceptionally responsive and helpful, and I hope that the Senate moves rapidly on your confirmation. There's been a lot of things that have been talked about at today's hearing, and I want to make sure we're getting clarity on the record, and particularly because of this issue about positive train control and lines owned by Amtrak, as well as all the other lines that we have passengers riding on, particularly in the Northeast Corridor. Is there anything else, and this is for you, Ms. Feinberg, that is needed to get positive train control on all portions of the Northeast Corridor, regardless of who owns the track? We know we've got funding for and a commitment by Amtrak to meet that, but we have lines owned in Connecticut substantially, a bit in New York, a bit in Massachusetts. Is there anything else in terms of funding or authority that is necessary for that?
Well, in terms of funding, there are funding struggles throughout the system on PTC. In terms of authority, we are concerned that some railroads will miss the deadline and that we will then lack the authority to force them to implement interim measures that will raise the bar in safety between that moment and when they actually have PTC implemented. We've asked the Congress for that authority. We think it's appropriate. If the deadline is going to be missed, we want to make sure that railroads are taking steps to raise the bar in safety before they implement PTC fully.
If you can follow up with us on the specific authority you believe you need, I have commuter lines dropping down from, say, Danbury, dropping down from Waterbury, through New Britain, through Meriden. These are really important for us to check.
We will do that.
Also, if you can, following up on the question from Chairman Schuster, and it's a similar question, is there any action you need from Congress or authority to follow up on evaluating the safety of these curves? Obviously, we want to get high-speed rail in, and if we're getting derailments that is well below what, say, the Acela that I take from time to time is running, is there additional authority that you believe you need from us to make that possible?
I don't believe that we need additional authority on the curves. Amtrak has supplied us with the curves that they're focused on. We're taking a look at that list. We will go back and forth with them and make sure that we agree on the actions moving forward on those specific curves. We are continuing to work on next steps that go beyond Amtrak on curves and speed, and we will have more to say on that in the coming days. I think there is going back to Chairman Schuster's question, some frustration that could more have been done following the Metro North incident. Again, you know, I'm not sure that comes down to authority so much as, you know, as regulators, we have very few tools, and the tools that we have are sometimes blunt instruments. And so emergency order authority is incredibly narrow and can't be as broad as we want. Safety advisories are recommendations. They don't have to be followed. And the rulemaking process takes years, so.
Thank you, and for you, Mr. Boardman, I have some concern, given the importance of these accidents, that so much emphasis being placed just on PTC. I'm looking at billions of dollars in infrastructure upgrades, and in particular, if you could talk about how are you going about prioritizing the bridges that are 100 years old and more, that the Northeast Corridor runs across these bridges every single day, and what, if any, help, in addition to the additional funding, which I joined my colleague and not only seatmate, but adjacent districts with Mr. Maloney, that we need a lot more funding to address this backlog of infrastructure, which is also safety. If a bridge goes down when a train is attempting to cross, that is also a safety concern. Can you talk a little bit about the prioritization?
Certainly. I think one of the most important things that occurred was in the PREA Act, the commission that was established in the Northeast of all the states, the federal government and Amtrak, to look at what projects needed to be done, what the backlog was, and how we needed to prioritize for the future. And a lot of that conversation that's occurred has really identified the projects that need to be done. The Portal Bridge, which would be about $1 billion project. So our priority is there for these infrastructure improvements, which will also improve safety. It's in place.
Thank you.
Mr. Zeldin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was actually on the route 24 hours beforehand. I represent New York 1 on the east end of Long Island. Some other members were traveling with me as well. And as we're here, I'd be remiss if I didn't offer up my thoughts and prayers to the families of those whose lives were lost, of those who were injured. It's a terrible tragedy that took place. I kind of wish that Congress had been willing to, the entirety of Congress would be willing to allow us and the families to mourn for Amtrak and for the employees of Amtrak, everyone who was impacted by it. I wish that there was a little more time that was dedicated towards mourning. Unfortunately, the next day, and I think it's pretty shameful and disgusting that not even 24 hours go by, and we have an entire party here in Congress that was blaming a potential future funding cut on an accident that happened yesterday. I mean, I've heard of spin, but this is a first for me. I mean, literally, you wake up the next morning, and instead of dedicating your day towards mourning the loss of those, the families that were so greatly impacted, you come onto the floor throughout these halls, and you stand in front of the cameras, and without saying my heart goes out to the family, without offering up any type of emotional remorse, because it's a terrible tragedy that impacts Amtrak, immediately you're blaming a potential future funding cut on an accident that happened yesterday. I would challenge anyone to find an example of this in history. And you couldn't even wait 48 hours to start with the politics. It started the next morning. The engineer was obviously traveling over twice the speed limit, and that's the reason why there's an investigation. It's very important to Amtrak that they finish the project of getting PTC operational, specifically on the Northeast Corridor. I know that this body passed legislation, being from the Northeast and knowing how profitable the Northeast Corridor and the Acela trains are. It's good that we see that money getting reinvested back into the system. I have some colleagues in some other parts of the country who may think otherwise, and that's okay. I'm parochial in a way to my home state, my home region. I came here from New York State in the state legislature. I served on Transportation Committee. The MTA, which is the nation's largest mass transit system for that locality, and we've heard the Metro North talked about and the Long Island Railroad, we found a way, Republicans and Democrats working together, to try to create a second track between Farmingdale and Ronkonkoma on Long Island for the Long Island Railroad. There are infrastructure improvements all over the New York City metropolitan area with the involvement of people at New York City, up in Albany, working with the MTA, working with the unions, trying to figure out how to invest in the infrastructure. It's also important to note that Amtrak legislation that was passed by the House discusses the RRIF component that allows the MTA to apply for the $1 billion in financing. But the investment can be made. It would be very nice if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, instead of us trying, and listen, when we ask it's a great idea, how are you going to pay for it, it's not to get to no, it's to get to yes. For me, personally, I want to be part of the discussion to figure out how we can invest in our infrastructure all across the country. That's what I believe is a matter of principle. But with my final minute, and Mr. Hart, just getting back to you, just so I understand something, are there texts on the phone from 9:10 to 9:21?
We know that there is text and voice activity that day. That's what we're trying to do, is narrow it down to specifically what time that day, so we can compare it with the.
But the phone record, the phone itself, like when you look at the phone and you scroll through text, it doesn't show a text from 9:10 to 9:21.
I don't have that answer yet. We will have a timeline of that by the time we're done.
Because I understand Ms. Comstock's frustration, and it seems like something that, if he gives you access to the phone, you look at the phone, and then you know the answer in 5 minutes.
We were surprised by the complexity of it ourselves.
Okay, and you can also bounce.
And we're experts at this.
The entire route, I mean, and I know you are, and I mean, the entire route has all these, you're getting cooperation from the cell phone companies, because you have all the cell phone towers, it pings off towers.
Yes.
I mean, it really shouldn't be that hard. Just so you know, for the families, the real advocacy, the effort on your part to try to get answers, and Amtrak's efforts, and all of you who are here for that cause, the frustration on our end, too, is just on behalf of constituents and families who are eager. They understand when some things take longer than others, but maybe they just don't understand on this front why we don't have more answers as far as the engineer goes. Yield back the balance of my time, and thank you for being here.
Time is expired. Gentlelady, Ms. Titus.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate and support all your efforts in the Northeast Corridor, but I'd like to shift west of the Mississippi for just a few minutes. At 11:19 on June 24th, 2011, a tractor-trailer driving north on US 95 slammed into the side of the Amtrak train number 5 on the California Zephyr line. This was at a railroad grade crossing outside the small town of Miriam in rural Nevada. Now, the driver of the truck was at fault. He'd been on duty for nearly 9 hours, I might add, but he failed to heed the train horn and went ahead and crossed the track. The impact of that created a fire. It killed the driver, killed the train conductor, killed 4 passengers. It injured 15 other passengers and 1 additional crew member. Now, PTC wouldn't have stopped that, but the investigation that was done by NTSB outlined concerns about side impact strength requirements for passenger cars and what happens with impact crashworthiness when it comes from the side. If you look at the report they issued, 2 recommendations were to develop side impact crashworthiness standards, including performance validation for passenger rail cars, and then once those side impact crashworthiness standards had been developed, to require that new passenger rail cars be built to those standards. I would just ask you, Ms. Feinberg, we've had all these studies about train-to-train collisions. Has any research been done on these types of side collision impacts?
Yes, ma'am. We're doing research now on the, at the NTSB's recommendation, we're doing research now on those side impact.
Is that it? Can you give me any more information about what that entails, or where you see that going, or will you be making recommendations or changing regulations?
Yes, ma'am. That research is ongoing, and we can get your office a full report. I mean, apart from that, we have done a tremendous amount of work on grade crossings generally, which have continued to be a problem for many years, and in fact are on a slight uptick this year. And we have a multifaceted approach to grade crossings generally, but on side impact collisions alone, our research is ongoing.
Well, if I could then ask Mr. Boardman, and this goes back to the very first question that Mr. DeFazio asked about buying new train cars. If this study, whenever it gets done, comes with the recommendation that new requirements should be made for train cars that meets some increased standards for side crashes, are we going to get any new cars? How many cars have we gotten? We've heard that they were 40 years old. You look at the pictures of the cars that were so crashed compared to the locomotive. Would you elaborate on that a little bit more?
These are the bi-level cars, which have a lower, very much a lower section. I went to that accident site, Lorette Lee.
I think
one
you
of
were
our
the
conductors.
assistant director or something at that time.
Pardon me?
I realized you were involved in this report at the for the accident in Nevada.
No, I was the CEO for Amtrak. I went out there
okay.
at that time and looked at what happened. It was a double tractor trailer. The side impact is what killed our conductor, but it was really a signal case that the back trailer came up and hit the top of the train that did the passenger injury or deaths and injuries. There is I think there would be, I'm not an engineer, mechanical engineer. There is a huge problem at that particular location. It was a very strange crash because there was total visibility for the truck that went into the side of the train. And if you were going to protect for that by replacing the equipment, you'd have major engineering that would have to occur, and I'd have to see whether any such thing could happen.
So you disagreed with the recommendation that they need to look at side?
No, I don't disagree with the recommendation at all. I just think it would be a very difficult thing we can't retrofit it for it, so it'd have to be new equipment. You're probably talking 450 of the bi-level type cars. You're talking probably $3.5 to $4 million a piece for each of those cars. That would be a substantial cost to doing that. And it would take us probably 10 years to make those kinds of changes and deliver new equipment.
What about as you buy new cars?
We haven't bought any new cars in a considerable period of time.
That's what was my point, going back to Mr. DeFazio's question. We've heard a lot about spending money for the signaling system, and we've heard money about infrastructure, but what about all these old cars? What's the plan there?
The plan right now, what we did with the single-level cars and with the locomotives, we're paying for that out of the fares that we receive in the Northeast Corridor. On the long-distance trains, there is no additional revenue. It is a completely deficit operation, and we don't have those resources to borrow money on the RIF program or any other way to replace those cars.
And that seems to me to be a problem.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of the witnesses for being here today. My first question, Mr. Boardman, going back to earlier statements you made during the Q&A, you had mentioned that there were 6 to possibly 10, if I'm doing the math right, vulnerabilities identified, similar to what we saw in the Northeast Corridor, the northbound train going toward the curve. And you mentioned that these types of curves existed, and have you installed code change points at those curves? And if so, was there a cost to do so?
So if you have to go back to the Back Bay incident in 1990, and when that occurred, the safety community got together, the operators got together to look at what needs to be done to protect ourselves in that case. And what they identified were 6 curves on the Northeast Corridor that they needed to treat. And those 6 curves included the north side of the Frankfurt curve, because the entrance speed at 110 was greater than what the turnover speed was in the curve itself.
Correct.
And so they put a code change point there.
Is there a cost to install the code change point there?
I'll get to that in a minute. On the south side, there was not a need to do that because the approach speed was 80 miles an hour, and therefore, even if that engineer failed to slow, they wouldn't overturn. So there were 6 places along the way.
Total of 6.
And there is a moderate cost to do anything, as you know, but it's not a major cost.
What's the moderate cost?
Automatic, I don't know. The automatic train control system really provides an idea whether there's something in front of you on the tracks. So the way that you do this code change is you really have a bit of fiction here. You say there is something at the curve, and so that's when you point, you put the code change point in. So it wasn't built to do positive train control.
Okay.
On the other four, where you added up 6 and 4, what we looked at with the FRA emergency order was the change that occurred here, and that in that conditions that exist on the south side, and we put that code change in on the south side, we looked to find out on the northeast corridor, we had 300 curves, what conditions or what curves meeting that condition need to be changed, and that's what we told FRA we would work to do.
Okay. I don't have a lot of time left, and I have a lot of questions. So if you could have your staff get back to me on if you found any other Amtrak corridors with the same issues, and when do you estimate you'll be done identifying and actually installing code changes on those areas identified as vulnerable?
We would only do this on the northeast corridor on the emergency order.
Are there any other?
Identified.
I mean, I have Amtrak corridors in my state of Illinois. Are there any other vulnerabilities there that you've identified?
You have them all over the United States because we're mostly on host railroads, and they depend on the expertise of our engineers and how the signaling system work, or if there's no signaling at all, and there are locations across the country where that occurs, they depend on what we call a Form D control point, a control system.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on to a different subject. In a 2012 Inspector General report, Amtrak was criticized because despite the legal requirements to do so, Amtrak did not include the funding requirements for PTC in its 5-year financial plan and annual budget requests. And this is directly from the IG report here. Your engineering and finance departments could not explain this critical omission. Can you?
Well, what we saw was in that particular report in 2012 was that they were looking for us to have come to Congress to specifically ask for PTC service. And that wasn't what we operated with Congress. It was almost like a block grant of capital projects. I identified as soon as I got over there what it was going to cost for us to meet this requirement by December of 2015. And it was about the safety of that, not about the dollars of that.
Okay, I'm reading the report here, and it just said further, a transportation official stated that his department's purposely omitted PTC installation costs on host railroad lines from Amtrak's 5-year plan in annual budget requests. He cited his belief that including these costs in the budget would weaken Amtrak's negotiating position with the host railroads, et cetera. That's concerning to us, but I appreciate the job you do. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all the witnesses. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Sanford.
Thank you. In deference to my dear chairman, I'm going to try and make my comments brief since I'm separating him and each one of you all from lunch. And you guys and gal have been most generous with your time. I appreciate it. I would associate my comments with what Congressman Zeldin said just a moment ago with regard to indeed mourning for the loss of life, a very sad day. But what I think is important in the wake of any sad day or any tragedy is to go in, do the investigation, but to make sure that in many ways, as a society, we don't overreact in ways in which that would make the system less sustainable from a financial standpoint. We don't overreact in ways in which really impinge upon sort of the cornerstone of the American Republic, which is individual liberty. And we don't overact in ways in which that become so constraining so that the practical effect is people say, well, I'm walking. I guess the safest of all mechanisms would be to put people in those things that you strap into at a public fair. I mean, you're locked in, but from the standpoint of practical effect, you can't use your laptop, you can't talk on the phone, and you'd say, I'm going to a different mode of transportation. And with that in mind, it seems to me in the course of the hearing, two ideas that have come out that I think would be dangerous in terms of overreaction to the real-world tragedy that each one of you all have had to deal with. One is this idea of seatbelts. You know, if you think about it, there's a reason there's seatbelts on airplanes, which is you have all kinds of vertical and horizontal considerations based on airlift that is well outside of the control of the pilot. We've been in those thunderstorm moments wherein you're like, oh my goodness, what's happening next? That does not occur on a train. And what we all know is when a plane crashes, wearing a seatbelt or not, tragically, a lot of people die. Same thing with school buses. I mean, a lot of kids ride to and from schools daily, and in most cases that I'm aware of, certainly in the case in South Carolina, there aren't seatbelts for those kids. I think it would have dangerous effect. I'd love to hear some of your further thoughts on this if you were to impose seatbelts as a reaction to this world tragedy. In my sense, it would be a step too far. The other, I guess, would be directed more to you, Mr. Pierce, and that is this notion of moving to two men in the front of the train. It seems to me it would be an added financial burden to the Amtrak system, which is already straining to the tune of more than $1 billion a year in terms of subsidy and other. And if you look at the whole notion of moving toward positive train control, the idea is to take out that possibility of human error, which wouldn't be, frankly, truncated or eliminated if you do move to a two-man system up front. I think it is important what you all have done at the Amtrak level to move to this notion of inward-facing cameras. I mean, I think that that can watch out for human error, but I think that that would be a step too far as well. And I apologize, that was my sister. Any thoughts on either one of those two as steps too far? She's relentless. Yeah.
I mean, we are moving ahead with inward-facing cameras. To be clear, this was something that my predecessor was moving ahead with prior to his departure. This committee has many times urged the FRA to make sure that we're making use of the RSAC committee process. We asked the RSAC to take action on inward-facing cameras. They've been unable to come to a conclusion. We told them last week that we were taking it out of the RSAC and moving ahead.
You'd agree with me on seatbelts or two men in the front?
Seatbelts, again, my concern is the way that I have been briefed on it is that the need to harden the seats in order to put seatbelts in would be more dangerous to passengers than belting passengers in. So if that is, you know, if the NTSB feels differently, we will start our engagement and conversations with them. But that is my understanding of why seatbelts may not be the best move on a train, because it would make people more dangerous. On two-person crews, you know,
And I just go back to marketability as well. Oftentimes when I travel to New York, I have a son that works there. I used to work there. The reality is people are up and moving, and that's part of why you take the train as opposed to getting on an airplane. You can be on the phone, you can be having a small group meeting with a couple other folks, and you take that out, I think you begin to lose market share that much further relative to plane travel. The other, though, I'm sorry?
On two-person crews, that's something we've been taking a close look at. To be clear, it's less relevant in passenger service because there are multiple people in a crew. So Amtrak had 5 people on the crew. I heard 6 people on the crew on this particular train. It usually is discussed separately. But you know, following the Metro North incidents, one thing we required of Metro North is for the engineer to be in almost constant conversation with the conductor to make sure that they are talking back and forth signals and to make sure that the conductor had access to an emergency brake, which is another good approach.
I hear my chairman's ever so gentle tap, tap, tap. I get the message, sir.
I'd like to thank the gentleman for being so expedient today and yielding back so much time. Mr. Bevin.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last but not least, hopefully. Thank you, witnesses, for your time and efforts as we try to reach answers to this great tragedy that occurred in the Northeast Corridor. It's been interesting to listen to some of these lines of questioning. It's hard for me to imagine why it's so complicated to get the answer to whether the engineer was utilizing a cell phone at the time of the crash. It seems like it should be just a simple answer, simple endeavor to find out exactly if as Mrs. Comstock in her line of questioning, hey, during this period of time, did he text? Did he use his phone? It should be there. Hard to find out, hard to figure out why that's not true. And in terms of further investigations, there was a news report, several of them, that stated that Amtrak Regional 188 had a fist-sized area of severe damage on its windshield, possibly consistent with that of being struck by some rock or object. 20 minutes before the crash of 188, a regional commuter train in the same area had to stop service after its window was hit by an object. Finally, also around the same time, Amtrak Acela 2173 was apparently also struck by an object while traveling southbound in the very same area. And there's an old saying that once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is a pattern. Do you think, Mr. Hart, that that applies here?
We are confident that the train left the station without any windshield damage because that's part of the inspection process before ever leaving the station. So we are confident that the damage occurred after leaving the station. What we don't know is whether it occurred before the accident or after the accident. We do know that it was not a weapon fired. The FBI helped us determine that, so we know that. But we know that rocks are thrown at windshields all the time, and it often cracks the windshield, and so that could have happened. But you know, that's a way that the windshield could be damaged, but it also could be post-accident damage as well.
So there has been no revelations or any findings during the investigation of any individual or individuals culprits responsible for the damage done to the other 2 trains as well. Have we found out anything in that regard?
No, we do not have any information yet in that regard.
Would anybody else, any other panelists, like to address that, the possibility of a damage to the windshield?
I think we have, time to time, have people throw rocks at our trains, but what's the specific question, sir, in terms of?
Well, you know, when I rode, I have family that lives in Manhattan, and they ride this train. I've ridden the train several times. It's along the same corridor, and I've remarked to myself and to others that there's certainly a lot of availability, the possibility of vandalism, somebody pitching something over onto a train or firing a weapon or whatever. And I just wonder if there's been any besides the investigation that's ongoing now, has there been any addressing of this possibility by NTSB or any of the other of your agencies?
We actually, the way we've been addressing a particular area that we have difficulty, including this one, is with our Amtrak Police Department and the partnerships we have with the police departments along the way. So as we've been there, we're looking to see where those rocks might have come from. And anywhere else that we have that kind of difficulty on the corridor, we do have an investigation that goes in to see if we can find the when and the where and who that might be tossing rocks. And it's generally an immature person, some kind of kids or something that are doing that. And it's not just to trains, it's to buses, to cars, to other kinds of conveyances as well.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hart, what time is it?
.106.
I got 106. That has 105. Do seconds matter on a train going 100 miles an hour?
They're very crucial, yes.
And my presumption, correct me if I'm wrong, is at this point as we speak, you have some general knowledge of what occurred with that cell phone. Is that a fair assumption, or have you just not looked at it at all?
Yes, we do. We are looking at it intensively with respect to May 12th, that specific
So
date.
you are
Yes.
dotting your I's and crossing your T's before you make a public statement?
Yes, that's very crucial that we get that fact right. We're not going
We're not going to be hurried into getting a wrong answer.
And is that the normal course of events for the NTSB?
Yes, and we are surprised by this because we are experts in this all the time. We look at cell phones all the time now because we're seeing it so frequently, unfortunately, in every mode.
I appreciate that. And again, like everyone else, I'm frustrated the cell phone thing's not settled yet. But I presume you've got some general information about what has happened. But
Yes.
you have been reluctant to say it because you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's, which is exactly what I want you to do. Now, it would be nice if you could dot all those I's and cross all those T's now. I hope it's soon. I assume it will be, but nonetheless, I guess I'm willing to wait. On seatbelts, Ms. Feinberg, you're not as old as I am. When I was a kid, we didn't have seatbelts in the car. We had them, but I'm not even sure if we had them. I take it back. I used to be thrown in the back of the station wagon, and we could, play all day long and run around the back of that station wagon until my mother or father turned around and made the classic threat, sit down and shut up, or I'll turn around, I'll stop this car. Every kid my age heard that. Yet we put seatbelts in cars. You restricted my freedom. Now I can't run around in the car. You have seatbelts in airplanes. You restricted my freedom, yet I can still get up, go to the toilet, talk to my friends in the back. God, and I understand fully well that the structure of current trains may not make it much use. I get that. And I get the fact that it may take us 5, 10, 15 years to get where we want to be on seatbelts. But at some point, again, on the presumption that seatbelts help, and I presume they do because the automobile industry and the airplane industry have instituted them, and I know some people don't wear them. I'm not perfect at it myself. I didn't start wearing my seatbelt until I started screaming at my own kids to put their seatbelt on, otherwise Dad would get arrested, which at that age they actually cared about. At some ages they're not so sure. And then I realized what a hypocrite I was, so I started wearing my own seatbelt, which, like it or not, it's better for me. I get that. And I'm not suggesting we need to put seatbelts in the train now, but to pretend that seatbelts in a train is somehow going to, restrict people's freedom and drive the ridership down is absurd. And I would simply encourage you, if it is a safety issue, again, I'm not the expert, I'll listen to the NTSB, if seatbelts can help save lives or stop injuries, then we should start planning on the implementation of them. And if it can't be done in the current train configuration, fine, I get that, but at some point, Mr. Boardman, you're going to order some new trains. When you do, maybe you can implement seatbelts in it. But those are the two things. And with that, I just want to do one other thing. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record materials from the FCC, which shows what the FCC has done to, I won't say help, but help and or hinder the railroad's move towards positive train control.
Without objection, so ordered.
That I yield back. And see, I did give you time.
Mr. Sanford were here, he would take note. Obviously, there's a lot of frustration in this committee and certainly a lot of tension to the lack of answers thereof. It has been 3 weeks now. This has been all over the media, rightly so. There have been loss of life. There are Americans that are still looking for answers on this as well. I know that you'll continue to do your research, but you've now come before the entire Transportation Committee of Congress to come here and not have cell phone information, whether the cell phone was on or off, operable, to not understand what those records are after 3 weeks, to not have an idea whether there was a mechanical failure when you have the train. A brand new Siemens train had been put in service less than a year ago, and we can't do the autopsy on the train and understand whether there was a mechanical failure. It sounds like while the engineer does not have recollection seconds before the crash, that he's at least being cooperative. We ought to have some assumptions or some facts on whether or not there could have been an operator error or an operator that actually created some type of malfunction. There are very few answers right now, 3 weeks after one of the most horrific crashes that our nation has ever seen. So because of that, we're going to ask you for a timely response to the questions that have come here today. We need to make a determination whether or not this body will have another hearing several weeks from now. So with that, I would ask unanimous consent that The record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may have been submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments, and that witnesses provide answers to our questions for the record within 15 days of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for being here today. Again, I would also like to thank our witnesses for your expedient response to the crash site itself and the collaboration that each of you showed in working together to resolve that. And Mr. Hart?
Yes, just one final comment. We have not found any anomalies with respect to the locomotive, just for clarification. We haven't found any anomalies with respect to the tracks, the signals, the brakes, or the locomotive that would explain this accident.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. If no other members have anything to add, the committee stands adjourned.
Okay, so I can use the gavel to start anything.